Chapter 70, Things to Say. The bedroom door creaked, and even that was loud enough to make Remus want to throw up. He didn't roll over to look at Creature, who had been kind enough to keep an eye on him while Sirius was at work, because then he really would be sick. He closed his eyes and then felt dizzy and decided that had been a bad idea. It wasn't Creature, but Sirius, who moved into his line of sight, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Remus winced as he was jostled. Sirius had fixed up most of his scratches and bruises and his broken forearm, but his joints still ached fiercely and his muscles burned. Sirius offered him 2 bottles, which Remus drained without hesitation. One was a comforting concoction and the other was a cramp cure, and Remus hoped that at least one, if not both, of them was liberally laced with painkillers. "Thanks," Remus croaked. Sirius nodded. "You're home early." "Marlene's back," Sirius whispered. Remus knew it was consideration for him that was behind the muted address, and appreciated it greatly. "Oh." Sirius grimaced and then shrugged, apparently determined to brush it off. "She didn't have a wand," Remus said. "How?" "Night business." Remus nodded, and then winced and set about stabilizing his head, while Sirius fixed his pillow. "Clever," he managed, gingerly lowering himself back onto the bed. Hailing the night bus didn't require a wand, after all, though wands could be used, only a wand hand, because there was a fair chance that a stranded witch or wizard might not have a wand on their person. And they didn't question that she was coming from a prison. "Apparently not," Sirius said. "She probably told them she had been arrested for using magic in public or something." He shrugged again. "It's good that she was able to escape, but next time he frowned. "If I even, now that she's back." Sirius trailed off, looking disconcerted. "Someone should probably have a word to Scrimgeour about the bus," he said finally. "Just in case." Remus agreed. Creature chose that moment to trot into the room. Remus couldn't actually see him, but he heard the crack of apparition on the landing, heard the door creak again, and heard Creature greet his master Sirius, carrying a large bowl of soup. Remus couldn't see that either, but he could smell it and his stomach grumbled appreciatively. Creature set the soup down on the bedside table, and together, he and Sirius moved Remus into a sitting position and then Creature bestowed him with his lunch. "Thank you, Creature," he said gratefully. "It smells wonderful." Creature swelled with pride and then hurried out of the room. The fact that he didn't apparate made Remus even more grateful, muttering about getting soup for Sirius too. "How's he been?" Sirius asked. "Very helpful," Remus said, blowing on a spoonful of his lunch. "Good," Sirius said. He checked his watch and then looked back at Remus. "It's Saturday," Remus said. "Habit," Sirius said, looking a little embarrassed. "Is he upstairs?" "I assume so," Remus said. "He came in with my morning potions and then I fell asleep and I haven't seen or heard from him since." Sirius' lips twitched, and then he cleared his throat and said, "I saw Dora on my way out today." "Must you?" Remus grumbled. His inner turmoil about the whole Dora situation was the reason the full moon had been so brutal last night, and he wasn't really in the mood to talk about her. "They're off to Azkaban tomorrow," Sirius continued, as if he hadn't heard, and Remus' insides twisted. He didn't like the idea of Dora being there at all, despite it being a necessary part of training, and he suspected she'd have a harder time of it than usual. Sirius had told him parts of what she had said to him, and Remus had gathered from that she was more hurt than he had anticipated, and also suffering from quite a bit of self-doubt. "I said she was welcome to come over afterward, if she's feeling up to it." Remus' insides twisted again, but he nodded, and tried not to squirm under Sirius' thoughtful look. Remus stirred his soup and didn't meet Sirius' eyes. Creature returned shortly after, with Sirius' lunch and Harry in tow. Harry whispered greetings to them both. He was obviously being careful not to upset Remus by being too noisy, and sat down on the desk while the pair of them finished their lunches. Harry had obviously noticed that Sirius was home early. Usually he worked until 2 on Saturdays, and it was only just noon, but he had also apparently decided that he wasn't going to ask about it. Remus watched with amusement as the two of them got caught up in a mimed conversation and then shuffled around until he was lying down again. He let his eyes slip shut. He was feeling pleasantly warm and full after soup, and his bed in Grimald's guest room was very comfortable. "The only thing I have to worry about now is Dora," he thought sleepily, and was already half asleep and therefore too far into unconsciousness to be worried about how their impending conversation would go. Instead, he just felt a small smile creep onto his face at the thought of seeing her soon. Tonks pressed the doorbell of number 12 and rocked back on her heels to wait, feeling nervous, but in a better mood than she had been for the last few days. The door opened almost immediately, startling her, and she tumbled off the top step and into the bush on the side, with a squawk. "Hello," Remus said, pale-faced and apparently as nervous as she was. "Watcher," she muttered, trying to extract herself from the bush without damaging it further. Sirius had never shown much interest in his garden, but Tonks suspected she'd have Creature after her if she mutilated it too much. "You were waiting," she added, trying not to sound accusing. "Maybe," Remus said, surprising her with his honesty. She blinked, and then patted her pocket for reassurance. The last chocolate frog, which she intended to give to Harry, from a box that has shown up with Strix that morning, rested there. "How was Azkaban?" "The chocolate helped," she said. It had. She had been so intent on trying to work out whether he had sent it as an apology, to be kind and protect her from the Dementors, as a romantic gesture, or simply because he had felt like it, that she had hardly noticed the Dementors at all. "Good," he said. "Thanks," she added, and he waved a hand, dismissing that. She knew Remus didn't have a lot of money. It was one of the many things she had learned when she had been him, so she knew that him spending it on her, when it wasn't her birthday, or Christmas, wasn't something that should be easily dismissed. "How was the full moon?" Remus looked surprised that she had remembered, and then grimaced. "That bad?" "I've had worse," he mumbled, and she believed him, but she also didn't think there were many that fell under the category of worse. An awkward silence followed that, and Tonks patted her pocket again, and Remus fiddled with a loose thread on his sleeve. Tonks spotted Sirius coming out of the study, and he paused when he saw them both standing on the doorstep. Remus turned to look at him too. A pained look flickered over Sirius' face, and he tucked his book under his arm and walked over. Remus looked grateful, and Tonks found that she was too. Sirius' mouth twitched and he pulled the door open wider, and stood in the doorframe, staring at the pair of them. When neither said anything, Remus was giving Sirius a pleading look, and Tonks was watching Remus' pleading expression and trying to work out why it was there. Sirius sighed. "This is just painful," he muttered, and Tonks' hair exploded into a shade of pink rivaled by Remus' cheeks. "What are you doing?" Sirius asked, with deliberate slowness. Remus and Tonks shared a look. "He bought me chocolate," Tonks blurted, at the same time as Remus said, "She fell into your petunias." "My what?" Sirius asked, goggling at Remus. "The plant," Tonks said, pointing. Sirius looked at the plant, then at the pair of them, and pinched the bridge of his nose. He let out a gusty sigh. "Oh, Bloody hell, Sirius said, you two are useless.
You're not helping,
Remus muttered.
Did you expect me to?
Sirius asked, arching an eyebrow. Remus opened his mouth and closed it.
Oh, all right.
Sirius muttered.
Would you like my advice?
Remus mumbled something that sounded like please, but Tonks couldn't be sure.
These,
Sirius said, poking Remus in the side of the mouth,
go here.
He put a cold finger on Tonks' lips and then cackled. Tonks felt her face heat up, and Remus looked mortified, and buried his face in his hands. Tonks could hear Harry chortling from somewhere inside.
You can go now, Padfoot, thank you,
Remus mumbled through his fingers,
and take him with you.
He nodded into the house, where Tonks could still hear Harry laughing. Sirius did go, winking at Tonks as he shut, but didn't latch, the door behind him.
Next full moon,
Remus said, lowering his hands to reveal a very red face,
remind me to eat him.
Tonks burst out laughing, and Remus subsided into chuckles.
Can do,
she said, grinning, once she could talk again.
Thank you,
he said, with a rueful smile back. He glanced at the door, hesitated, and then gestured to the park on the other side of the street.
Would you like to go for a walk?
Tonks sobered immediately, and glanced at Remus, who looked torn between wanting her to say yes, and wanting her to turn him down. She managed to nod. They walked for about 5 minutes, in tense silence. Tonks was trying to think of what to say, and was sure Remus was doing the same, and eventually found a place to sit. The bench in the park had been claimed by an old man who was feeding the birds, so Tonks claimed one of the swings, while Remus went to sit on the steps that led up to the slide and rope bridge. Tonks made piles of bark chips with her feet, and Remus was apparently fascinated by a patch of graffiti on one of the support beams.
So,
he said, surprising her by speaking first,
you fancy Sirius' best friend?
Tonks lifted her eyes off the ground and found that he was looking at her. She nodded slowly.
For a while now,
she admitted.
I'm not good, I'm not right for you,
Remus said.
I'm old and poor and I'm dangerous. You are not dang.
A boy, who was maybe a year younger than Harry, chose that moment to come barreling up and deposit himself on the swing beside Tonks. She gave the boy a narrow-eyed look, which he ignored, and then she threw Remus a helpless look instead. He seemed rather unimpressed by the boy's presence too. 10 minutes later, the boy had apparently had his fun on the swing, and went charging off, sending bark chips flying everywhere, toward the main part of the playground. He climbed over Remus, and got an irate look in return, and then screeched as he went shooting down the slide, and back toward his mother.
You're not dangerous,
Tonks said at once. Remus smiled sadly.
We had this conversation when you told me about your condition before you went off to the camp to help Matt.
And bloody hell, doesn't that seem like ages ago?
And I didn't care then, so why would I care? Because if we were to... If we were to what?
Tonks asked, her heart beating.
You're not listening,
Remus said, looking agitated.
I'm dangerous, and you need someone young and whole. Young and whole?
She asked.
Implying that, what, you're old and broken. And dangerous. I'm an Oro trainee,
Tonks said loudly. The man feeding the birds looked over. The noise had startled most of the feathery crowd around him, and then away again.
Danger isn't really a concept for me, so don't give me that rubbish.
He opened his mouth to say something, but she cut him off.
And I'm dangerous too. You.
Remus asked, incredulous.
3 years of tuition under Mad Eye and I'll be hexing everything that moves,
she said, folding her arms.
Maybe you're the one that's at risk. You're missing the point. No, Remus, you're missing the point. I appreciate that you care enough to try to point out the things that you see as problems, but I've thought about this. None of those things that you think are getting in the way bother me. Not one. The only thing that's stopping this is you.
Remus said nothing. Tonks waited, not sure whether she was expecting an argument, or him to admit that she was right, but she got neither. She stood up and almost tripped on the bark chip piles she had made. She had to grab the chain of the swing to keep herself upright.
Where are you going?
He asked.
Well, since you've obviously run out of things to say on the matter, I'm going back to Sirius.
She tried not to sound hurt, but was disappointed that they hadn't actually managed to reach an agreement. She hadn't talked him into it, and he hadn't talked her out of it. They were on the same, though marginally friendlier, terms as before.
He's promised me dinner.
She saw Remus standing up out of the corner of her eye, but couldn't bring herself to stop and wait for him. He could catch up if he wanted to, or he could hang back, and have time to think. That too, was up to him. She was almost to the street when she became aware of Remus' footsteps right behind her. She turned around, she couldn't have said why, and her eyes widened when she realized just how close he was. She glanced up at his eyes, which were troubled, and then, before she could help herself, her eyes dropped to his lips. Remus, though, was the one that took half a step forward, and Remus was the one who bent his head and pressed his mouth to hers. For the briefest moment, before he backed off, looking sheepish. Tonks stared at him, her heart hammering. He looked shocked now, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done, and somewhat pleading, he was well and truly leaving the next move up to her. She stepped forward, using her metamorph magic to make herself taller as she moved, and kissed him again. Gawain stepped out of Scrimgeour's office. He had been meeting with the head Auror every day for a week now, trying to secure McKinnon's future in the program, and set off down the corridor with a spring in his step. Black, laden with a large stack of parchment, was talking with Weasley outside the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office. Gawain wasn't sure what they were talking about, but Weasley was making elaborate hand gestures and Black was shaking his head and speaking with an amused but earnest expression. Gawain caught Black's eye. Black smiled and shrugged, since his hands were too occupied to move, a greeting, and continued on toward his cubicle. McKinnon was sitting at her old desk, the one Black had occupied between her disappearance and her return late last week, and she murmured a greeting as he entered. It was strange how much the atmosphere in the cubicle had changed. With McKinnon, there was a quiet but strong sense of purpose that came with her presence, and just a hint of fragility, and unease. With Black, there had been determination, and usually a fair bit of noise, shuffling papers, quill scratching, fingers tapping on the desk, Black muttering, or outright talking, as well as a completely at ease sort of air. Gawain was pleased to have McKinnon back, but it seemed quiet without Black around. He pursed his lips and sat down at his desk.
Your position is still yours, if you want it,
he said, and McKinnon jerked and looked up. He pulled her sidekick, which Black had returned to him a few days ago, out of his robes and offered it to her. She took it.
The final decision was made today.
He saw potential in McKinnon, which was the reason he had fought so hard to get her back, and also to keep his position as her mentor. Scrimgeour was tough but fair, and had voiced some concern over how stable she was, but Roberts truly thought she was over the worst of it. Certainly, she had seemed more balanced since she had come back, but only time, and exposure to Black would tell. Bones had vouched for McKinnon's return, saying that whatever recovery she had to do could be done in the program, that McKinnon would recover sooner if she was doing something, and Scrimgeour had given his permission for her to continue in the program, as long as Gawain was willing to put in the extra effort.
Really?
McKinnon asked, smiling.
I'd, if you'll have me, sir, then. Of course I'll have you,
Gawain told her. They'd have a tough few months ahead. McKinnon would need to keep up with the current coursework, as well as make up what she had missed since May, but he thought it was possible.
Thank you,
she said, and then frowned and set down her quill.
What? What about Sirius?
She asked.
What about him?
Gawain asked neutrally.
I haven't seen him since that first day,
she said, tucking her hair behind her ear.
I would suggest,
Gawain said gently,
that you worry about your own location and well-being, and not Black's, for the time being.
McKinnon obviously recognized the subtle barb, but pushed the matter anyway, her cheeks faintly pink.
He's left, hasn't he?
Gawain hesitated and then shook his head.
No,
he sighed.
He's around the place, doing odd jobs for me and for Scrimgeour and Bones.
Black had attempted to resign on the day he returned the sidekick, but Gawain had asked him to stick around and help out with a few things. It wasn't the sort of work Black was after, but Gawain knew he had enjoyed working and figured something was better than nothing. Scrimgeour had caught on quickly and the pair of them were working to find a long-term position for him, but it was proving to be harder than they had anticipated. Black had aura training, but that had been a long time ago, and he had had little opportunity to keep his skills up during his time in Azkaban, and were they to promote him to aura without any testing or training, there would certainly be complaints from other DMLE workers. It would, of course, be possible to get him into the program, but Gawain rather thought Black was better than that, and that sitting through the training session would be an insult to the man's intelligence, even though it was unlikely Black would ever complain. They were toying with a few alternatives, and Black remained unaware of any of them, and the most likely of those required Black to be around the department for a few weeks in advance.
Around? But I haven't seen him,
she said. Gawain met her curious look with an impassive expression, and understanding dawned on her face.
Oh. We thought it would be best for him to stay out of the way until you had settled in again.
McKinnon did not seem impressed to hear that. She folded her arms, and her forehead crinkled.
This is what I was afraid of,
she said dejectedly.
What was?
Gawain asked.
That I'd affect him,
she exclaimed, drumming her fingers on the desk, in a gesture oddly reminiscent of Black himself.
That by being back, I had changed things, and I have. He's lost his job. McKinnon,
Gawain said, patiently,
you vanishing is what got him the job in the first place.
McKinnon was silent as she considered that.
And you, regardless of what happens, or where you go, will always affect someone. Not wanting to doesn't stop it happening, and the sooner you realize that, the better off you'll be.
Sirius scratched the polka-dotted bowtie he had worn for the occasion and scratched the large red nose that Dora had helped him grow. Harry was dressed like a mummy tonight, and covered from head to toe in thick bandages. The only part of him that wasn't off-white fabric were his eyes, for once unguarded by his glasses, Sirius had put a charm on him to give him temporary eyesight without glasses, and had caught Harry reaching up to adjust them before remembering they weren't there several times already. His rucksack, which sat, half open on the hard ground beside him, was almost stuffed to the brim with sweets they had collected on the way. Remus was dressed as a ghost, one bearing a strong resemblance to the Bloody Baron, despite Sirius suggesting they should use magic to let him survive a night looking like nearly headless Nick, and together the three of them, the clown, the mummy and the ghost, made a horrifying trio. Sirius glanced over his shoulder and out the gates to make sure Remus was still out by the statue. He was, a tall, pale figure in the dark. Sirius knew he was talking, or that he had been when he and Harry had left him, to them, to James, or to Lily or to both. He wasn't sure, and was reasonably sure it was about Dora. Sirius smiled to himself and turned his attention back to Harry, who was sitting on the ground beside the orange and yellow spotted lily they had planted on Christmas the year before, and a now familiar collection of flowers. There was the single white lily, the bunch of wild flowers, the bunch of purple hyacinths and the red and yellow lilies. Harry was talking too, about school, and Sirius' smile became rather bittersweet. He swallowed thickly and retreated, almost tripping over his ridiculously large shoes, to a tree a few yards away, where he was able to keep an eye on Harry and Remus both, without being too close to them.
"Hey, Prongs," he said, easing himself onto the hard ground.
The dirt wasn't frozen yet, but it was certainly close to it.
"Lils."
He didn't get a response, but he could picture it, James grinning and calling him Padfoot, and Lily, smiling, and running forward to give him a warm hug. Sirius cleared his throat.
"Happy Halloween!"
He could picture their sad smiles, practically feel James' hand on his shoulder, or Lily's small hand squeezing his own. Sirius talked quietly about all the things that had happened since he last spoke to them. Talking to Lily and James wasn't an every-night thing, anymore. He still did it at least once a week, or more if he was having trouble sleeping, but it was more relaxed nowadays, and he no longer felt horrendously guilty if he missed a night here or there. He told them what he had said to Remus about lips and where to put them, and spent a few moments imagining James' howls of laughter, and Lily telling him that was mean through her own laughter. He told them that he had seen them kissing in the hallway before Dora went home and had been harassing Remus about it ever since. He told him that Harry had seen them kissing on a separate occasion, and hadn't been able to look at Remus for 2 days, and was still prone to blushing whenever he was in the same room as Remus and Dora, but that he had confided to Sirius that it was nice that Moony was happy. And that, as a result of the Harry incident, Creature had sat Remus down and lectured him for 10 minutes about decent behavior around children, despite the fact Remus and Dora hadn't been doing anything inappropriate. He told them about his week running odd errands in the DMLE, and how a friendly conversation with Arthur Weasley about magic carpets had turned into a discussion about Muggle transport. Sirius, nostalgically, had mentioned his motorcycle. Arthur had thought that was a function of a clothes washing machine, not a bike, until Sirius set him straight, and had then realized exactly who he was talking to and had asked Arthur not to arrest him, when, to his relief, Arthur had mentioned a car. They were having lunch on Tuesday for a longer talk about mechanics. And he told James and Lily that he was going to go and see Hagrid on Wednesday and find out what had happened to his old bike. He told James about his and Harry's walks to and from school, and about the cat he had chased the other day, and about the full moon and that Harry had finished his first term of school and that it was quite nice to have him home again. Sirius was cutting back his hours during the holiday period, and only working mornings on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and on Saturday afternoons.
"And when he goes back, there are these conference things,"
Sirius told the sky. He was lying down now, under the tree, and could see Harry and Remus writing on a piece of paper with a pencil they had got from Merlin knew where.
"For parents and the teacher. I thought he might have been in trouble, but apparently everyone has them. We never had them at Hogwarts, though, so it must be a Muggle thing. But apparently we've got to ask questions, or... well, I'm not sure."
Harry had mentioned he had a notice about it, but it was probably crushed in the bottom of his rucksack. Sirius made a mental note to ask him later.
"Should be fun though, eh?"
He hesitated, and sat up, folding his legs, with difficulty, thanks to his shoes, under him.
"You don't mind, do you?"
he asked, a little worried. This time, his imagination didn't fill in the silence.
It's the sort of thing you would have loved, Lils, being able to talk to his teacher, and meet his friends' parents, and prongs. You're his, I'm not, it should be you, not me. Things have a funny way of working out,
a wry voice said, startling him. Marlene steadied herself, obviously she had just apparated, out of the dark, holding a large bunch of yellow, pink, indigo and white roses. Sirius knew it was coincidence that she had chosen to greet him that way, but he was still disconcerted that she had managed to address his last statement.
I thought I'd come later, and stay out of your way, but here you are. So you can recognize me with colorful hair, a red nose and face paint, but not as a woman?
Sirius asked, getting carefully to his feet.
Apparently,
she said, giving him a small smile.
I suppose James changed your hair color and hexed your features enough at school that I've learned to distinguish what's underneath.
Sirius smiled back, unable to help himself.
Sounds about right.
He paused.
Did you want us to leave? Not because of me,
she said, and Sirius nodded slowly. They stared at each other and then he said,
You're still blonde.
Marlene pulled on a strand of her hair, which was longer than Sirius had ever seen it, and sighed.
I still don't quite feel like me, she said. And I'm not sure if it's because I look different, or if it's best to look different because I feel different. Does that make sense?
Not really, Sirius said. She gave him another tiny smile and shrugged in a helpless sort of way, and Sirius wasn't sure how to respond, so he said nothing. She watched him, and apparently realized he wasn't going to say anything, and turned and made her way over to where Harry and Remus were. Sirius trailed behind her, watching curiously as Remus offered a polite greeting, while Harry shoved the piece of paper into his rucksack.
Hello,
Harry said, once the paper was out of sight. Marlene didn't seem to have noticed.
Harry,
Marlene said, and Sirius couldn't see her face from where he was, but thought she might be smiling again.
Have you been keeping out of trouble? No more kelpies.
Harry shook his head, looking amused, and a little sheepish. Sirius went to stand beside Harry, and put a hand on his shoulder, but Harry didn't seem worried by Marlene's presence. Remus was watching them all from a few feet away, with a shrewd expression. Harry went to join Remus a few minutes after, and the mysterious piece of paper emerged again, sparking serious interest. He decided to let that wait, though. Marlene had put her roses down, and was standing beside him with her arms wrapped tightly around her upper half, and very bright eyes.
This is where it happened, you know,
she said, in a falsely casual voice. She pointed to a patch of ground by their feet, and Sirius looked over at her. Her eyes were unfocused, and he couldn't read the expression in them.
Peter. He was right there.
Sirius' eyes latched onto the patch of ground.
I caught him right there.
She sniffed, and Sirius looked up to see her brushing her eyes.
Robert's never told me where,
he said softly, his eyes tracing Lily and James' names on the gravestone.
Here,
Marlene said thickly. Sirius just nodded and reached out to take her hand with his own, white-gloved one. Marlene sniffed again, and looked at him, and then gently but firmly pulled her hand away. Sirius let her, and nodded again, his own throat now feeling rather thick.
Padfoot,
Harry said, stumbling over with a wary-looking Remus behind him.
Yeah?
Sirius asked, clearing his throat. Marlene was staring fixedly on the grave, not paying any attention to the three of them.
The spell on my eyes is fading,
he said, wobbling a bit as he squinted at Sirius through the slit in his bandages. Sirius reached out to steady him.
It's worn off. It's flickering,
Harry said. It was disconcerting to only be able to see his eyes. The rest of his face was so heavily bandaged that Sirius couldn't see what his expression was. If he had to guess, he'd have said Harry had wrinkled his nose.
"We might head off then,"
he said, addressing Harry, but his eyes went to Remus, who nodded. Out of the corner of his eye, Sirius saw Marlene turn her head to look at them. As soon as he moved, though, her attention went right back to the graves. He took Harry's hand, and Harry took Remus' hand.
"Bye,"
Harry said.
"Bye, Harry,"
Marlene said back, and returned Remus' awkward wave. Her eyes flicked to Sirius, who still hadn't worked out what to say, if anything.
"Happy Halloween,"
he said after a moment, and then spun on the spot. Her returned Happy Halloween followed them into apparition, in a rather ghostly manner. End of chapter. Chapter 71, Needing a Friend.
"Mummy, have you seen my other gumboot?" "They're outside by the clothesline, dear,"
Mum answered absently, loading another set of steaming mince pies onto Ron's plate.
"One was, but the other's not." "By the chickens." "I already looked there,"
Ginny said, folding her arms.
"Well, I haven't seen them, then,"
Mum said. Ginny continued to glower at her and opened her mouth, probably to tell Mum to summon it or something, but Mum passed Ron his plate and picked up another one, without even looking at her daughter.
"Now, sit down and have some lunch before you go charging off, and then I'll help you find them."
Mum passed Ginny a plate, and Ginny, seeing she had no real choice in the matter, flopped into the closest seat, looking sulky. Ron wolfed down his lunch, while Ginny only picked at hers.
"Stop fussing,"
Mum told her. Ginny glowered at her and shoved a whole pie into her mouth, and then made a show of chewing with her mouth open.
"Ginny!"
Mum snapped. Ron sniggered, and then Mum shot him an angry, "Be quiet now or else" sort of look, and he averted his eyes. Ginny swallowed and folded her arms again.
"I didn't raise you to eat like Ron,"
Ginny suggested. Mum glanced at Ron, who had unfortunately picked that moment to try to fit 2 pies in his mouth, and then threw her hands up in the air.
"Oh, Ron, really, you're nearly 11.
Mum said exasperatedly.
"Thanks AOT,
Ron managed to mutter to Ginny, who grimaced, as Mum's attention transferred to him.
"You really should know better. Just what people think if they saw you eating like SO1L here,"
Ron argued.
"That's not the point."
Mum snapped. She scratched at the back of her neck absently, and then looked frustrated.
"And don't talk back to me, and certainly not with your mouth full."
She tucked her tea towel into her apron and sent the tray of pies floating back to the kitchen.
2 pies? I don't know what you were thinking."
Ron looked at Ginny in askance, and only got a shrug in return. Ron swallowed his mouthful, and thought that maybe he had bitten off more than he could chew, and snagged the last pie off his plate, before hopping off his chair and heading for the stairs. Ginny made to follow, but Mum spotted her and started yelling about Ginny not finishing her lunch. Ron didn't stick around to see the outcome. When Mum really started up, and it sounded like that's what was happening, it was best to either run, or just endure it and try to gently get her to see reason. Charlie had once told Ron that Mum usually overreacted, but that she never started up without cause. Ron didn't quite believe that, but Charlie was better at him with that sort of thing, so Ron had taken his word as law. Ginny had been told something similar from Bill, Ron knew, but she seemed to have decided that arguing back was the best course of action, and had been employing that technique with Mum with varying degrees of success for almost a year. The first time she had yelled back, Mum had been so startled that she had stopped yelling. Ron had thought it was terrifying, and maybe the coolest thing he had ever seen, because Mum was scary sometimes. The second time, Mum had been surprised, and not at all impressed. Admittedly, Ginny had sneaked out at night to do Merlin knew what and not been in her bed the next morning. She had broken her leg somehow, and Ron and Dad had found her by the orchard, early the next morning, and had been so angry and so worried that Ron had genuinely feared that she might explode. And, every time after that, both had generally been too stubborn and too fired up to back down, resulting in a scene that Ron, and Dad, when he was home, both thought it was bad to avoid. Ron paused once on the stairs to itch. He didn't know where he was itchy, just that he felt something uncomfortable. After a few seconds of his hands hovering over his sides and shoulders, but not finding the part responsible for his discomfort, Ron reluctantly lowered his hand and continued the trek up to his room. Weird, he thought, shaking his head. He didn't actually feel better, just couldn't find the source. He rolled his shoulders and rubbed his feet on the patchy carpet outside Fred and George's room, but that didn't help either. Disconcerted, Ron decided to try to forget about it. It would have to go away eventually. Ginny caught up with him on the stairs, obviously wanting company, and Ron was happy for the distraction.
"Who won?"
Ron asked, pushing open his bedroom door.
"Mum,"
Ginny said crossly, scratching at her ribs.
"You haven't seen my gumboot, have you?"
"No," Ron said, kicking a dirty chword out of the way so he could make it to his bed. He flopped down, having decided to lie down and let his lunch settle before doing anything else. Ginny followed him in, apparently under the impression that her plight entitled her to come in.
"Ginny."
"What?" she asked, the color rising in her cheeks. Ron knew that she knew what he was talking about, though.
"You're allowed in my room. It's fair that I should be allowed to."
"Out," Ron told her, pointing to the door.
"But, Ron."
"Ginny, out," he said firmly.
"You know the rules." "It's a stupid rule,"
Ginny snapped, but she stomped over to the door, stepped through it and sat out on the landing. Ron grinned and she huffed and crossed her arms.
"So why are you looking for your gumboots anyway?" "I'm supposed to be going to Luna's,"
Ginny sighed. Ron snorted. He had, thankfully, never had anything much to do with Luna Lovegood. Mum and Mrs. Lovegood had been putting Ginny and Luna together since they were little, but Ron had somehow managed never to be included and he had no intention of starting that now. Luna was, according to everyone, very strange.
"Oh, don't,"
Ginny said. She crawled into his room. Ron started to tell her off about it, and picked up a loose trainer, threw it at him, and then crawled out again. It hit his shoulder, and Ron knew he was lucky it hadn't hit him in the face. Ginny had the best arm of all of them.
"Luna's not that bad." "She's loony,"
Ron said.
"You've hardly talked to her,"
Ginny protested.
"Yeah, but when I did, she told me my head was filled with rack-somethings, and when we went there on New Year's, her dad served that horrible, crunchy—"
Ron's nose wrinkled with remembered dislike.
"Oh, the scarab salad,"
Ginny said, looking ill.
"Don't say the name,"
Ron said, cringing.
"Erg, I can taste it."
He got up, grabbed a chocolate frog off his desk, broke it in half and threw a piece at Ginny, who stuffed it into her mouth at once, despite her earlier reluctance to eat lunch.
"That was pretty horrible,"
Ginny admitted, shuddering.
"But it doesn't mean Luna's. She has weird food and she talks about things I don't understand,"
Ron said. He knew he was the stupid Weasley. Bill and Percy were brilliant and so were the twins, but in a different way, and Ginny was a sort of merge of their older brother's academic and experimental talents, but not as clever, while Charlie was the active Weasley, but even he had been good at his chosen subjects, but that didn't mean that Ron liked being reminded of it, and Luna always managed to do just that. She had a habit of saying something confusing and then not offering an explanation.
"Poor you,"
Ginny said scathingly, rubbing her shoulder against the doorframe. Ron suddenly became aware of his own hand, scratching vigorously at his knee, but not generating any relief.
"I think Luna's fantastic, and... Are you itchy?"
Ron asked. Ginny stopped what she was doing and cocked her head at him.
Yes, but..."
There was a strange noise from downstairs and Ron was on his feet before he realized it, and clambering over a puzzled Ginny to get to the landing.
"Mum!"
he called, sticking his head over the rail.
"Mum!"
"Ginny!" Mum called back, her voice sounding off. Ron was affronted for a moment, before he realized that Mum hadn't actually mistaken their voices, she was genuinely calling Ginny.
"Luna's arrived, dear. I thought you were going there,"
Ron said, turning to his sister.
"I am,"
Ginny said, getting to her feet, with a nervous look toward the railing. Mum's muffled voice was drifting upstairs, but Ron couldn't make out words. The two of them shared a look, and then Ginny started heading downstairs, and Ron, aware that something had happened, itched absently at his elbow and followed.
"Hi, Luna!"
Ginny called, when they reached the kitchen. Mum and Luna were sitting on the couch, with their backs to them, but Mum turned as soon as Ginny spoke. Ron's sense of unease heightened when he saw the tears on Mum's face. Luna was slower to turn, but when she did, she was paler than usual and very teary, which was a weird thing to see on Luna, who was usually so airy and detached. She had a long set of scratches on the side of her neck. Those, Ron noticed, were tinged with the blue of Mum's favorite healing potion.
"Hello, Ginny,"
she said in a flat voice.
"It's a good thing you were running late."
Ginny looked at Ron, who wasn't sure why she had looked at him and not Mum. He wasn't sure what was happening, or what he should say, if he should say anything at all, so he wasn't going to be very helpful. He shrugged at her.
"Mum,"
Ginny said, uncertain.
"Mrs. Lovegoods had an accident, dear,"
Mum said, looking teary again all of a sudden. Ron's stomach sank, because anything that made Mum look that way couldn't be good.
"She's dead,"
Luna said, in a voice that was almost conversational. There was a horrified pause, where Ginny took half a step closer to Ron, and Ron tried to wrap his head around the fact that someone he knew had died, and Mum's hand hovered over Luna's shaking shoulder. Mum obviously wasn't sure whether it was okay to pat it, and Luna watched them all with her large eyes. Then Luna burst into tears, and Mum looked aghast and lifted another hand. Obviously she wanted to hug her, but Ginny beat her there. She walked quickly but steadily, climbed over the couch, and Mum didn't even tell her off for it, and wrapped Luna in a hug.
"Mr. Lovegoods with the Aurors,"
Mum told Ron, in a thick voice.
"And they'll come to speak to Luna, once they're finished at the house."
Mum sniffed, and looked at the clock. All of the hands except hers, Ron's and Ginny's, rested on work or school, and then back at Ron, with a torn sort of expression. It took Ron a moment to work out what she wanted. Dad wasn't here, and neither were Bill or Charlie, who were much better at handling these things than Ron was. "I suppose I'll have to do," Ron thought, and hugged Mum. She let out a sob and clutched him closer. Ron itched his cheek. The last of the itching was fading, thankfully, and let her hug him. Sirius had given Hagrid several days' notice that he and Harry would be dropping by, and Hagrid was notoriously bad at keeping things private, so Sirius wasn't really surprised that, when Hagrid opened the door to greet them, he could see Dumbledore sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a bucket-sized mug of tea. Sirius hesitated, not sure how to react to that. Should he be friendly, or cold, or polite, or should he make a scene? But before he could react to that, he, and a startled Harry, had been swept up into a bone-crushing hug.
"How've ya been?"
Hagrid asked, beaming as he set them down. Harry looked rather rumpled, had to straighten his glasses, but he smiled back shyly. He had only met Hagrid once, at the trial.
"Good,"
Sirius said, feeling an answering smile spread over his face.
"Keeping busy. I'm over at the DMLE again, doing odd jobs."
He watched Dumbledore's face, which didn't change at all, and Sirius surmised that he had probably heard about it from Amelia or Mad-Eye.
"And otherwise, I'm home with this one."
Hagrid's black eyes crinkled at the corners as he regarded Harry, who shifted, apparently a bit unsure what to make of the scrutiny.
"I'll bet that keeps ya busy,"
Hagrid said, chuckling.
"Best witch and wizard I ever knew, your mum and dad, but your dad was a handful at times."
That drew a funny smile out of Harry, who was looking at Hagrid's enormous hand, and Sirius would have bet anything that he was wondering if Hagrid meant a literal handful.
"He's better behaved,"
Sirius said. Harry grinned at him, and Sirius was abruptly reminded that 2 days ago, Harry and Remus had enlisted Creature to help them slip a skin-changing potion into Sirius' morning cup of tea. He had to give them credit for it too. The effects had been subtle, and he had only turned a very faint orange, instead of neon, and everyone at work had given him odd looks because of it. Even now, Sirius looked a bit like he was sporting a bad tan.
Despite Remus' best efforts. Terrible influence, that one.
He shook his head. Hagrid boomed a laugh at that, and behind him, Dumbledore took a sip of tea to hide his smile.
"Where is Remus?"
Hagrid asked.
"I'd have thought he'd be with ya." "He's having lunch with a friend,"
Sirius said.
"He says hi though, and said he'll stop by soon."
Hagrid beamed at them both again, and then stepped aside to let them into his hut. Sirius went first, and Harry followed without hesitation. It hadn't changed much in the years since Sirius had last been there. Everything looked a little older, and the floor was more worn, but the mugs were new, and the window seemed to have been replaced recently. Hunter, Hagrid's old dog, was gone, replaced by a rather menacing-looking boarhound, and, knowing Hagrid's dogs, the new one was probably had all the menace of a puffskein, and a rather strange-looking creature, a bit like a frog, crossed with a butterfly, was fanning its wings in a cage in the sun on the windowsill, watching the snowflakes swirl idly outside.
"Sirius,"
Dumbledore said courteously. The smile he gave Sirius was uncertain, and Sirius was oddly comforted by the fact that Dumbledore wasn't quite sure where they stood with each other either.
"Sir. How are you?" "Good, thank you." "And, Harry?"
Dumbledore said, smiling much more genuinely. An answering smile appeared almost instantly on Harry's face.
"Hi, sir,"
he said. Hagrid's dog chose that moment to come over and introduce itself. Harry, not seeming the least bit concerned, held out a hand for him to sniff, and then stepped forward to pet him. The dog's tail started to wag lazily, and Dumbledore glanced between Harry, the dog, and Sirius in a bemused sort of way.
"That's Fang,"
Hagrid said.
"Watch your robes, he dribbles and he sheds." "So does Padfoot,"
Harry said, grinning. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled like mad, and Hagrid looked confused for a moment, before he started to chuckle again. They settled at the table. Harry placed himself between Dumbledore and Sirius wasn't sure whether he had sensed the tension and done it on purpose, or whether it was by chance, and Hagrid brought them tea and stoat sandwiches and fudge before sitting down himself. Fang had moved from Harry to Sirius and was leaning on him instead of standing. Lazy mutt, Sirius thought, amused, as he scratched Fang behind the ears and was rewarded with a doggy sigh.
Thank you, Hagrid,
Dumbledore said, holding up a hand as Hagrid made to pour him another cup of tea.
but I should be on my way. Oh,
Hagrid said, looking a bit put out.
Well, thanks for coming by. Let me get the door for you. I can show myself out,
Dumbledore said kindly.
You have guests to entertain.
He smiled at both of them again, and this time, Sirius' return smile wasn't as forced. He said his goodbyes and left, and Hagrid and Sirius talked, while Harry listened and stared at the thing on the windowsill, before the conversation got to what Sirius had come for in the first place.
I actually wanted to ask you about my old bike,
Sirius said, taking a sip of tea.
I never got it back after Halloween, obviously.
Both of the adults glanced briefly at Harry, who missed it because his attention was elsewhere.
And then with being arrested, and Azkaban, and everything, I was sort of wondering what happened to it. Well, I tried to find Yeh, of course,
Hagrid said,
but then Yeh got taken away, and so I brought it back here. Didn't know what to do with it, but Dumbledore, great man, Dumbledore.
He added, and Sirius smiled, amused,
knew. He took it up to the castle and put it somewhere safe. Do you know where?
Sirius asked. Hagrid shook his great head.
Best to ask him, I'd say,
Hagrid said.
Right,
Sirius said.
Thaw, kiddo, don't touch that, we don't know what it is.
While Hagrid's dogs were usually friendly and gentle, Sirius was yet to meet any of his other pets that could be classed as such. Generally, they were all poisonous or violent. Harry, who had made his way over to the frog butterfly on the windowsill, jumped and looked around guiltily.
I wouldn't have touched it,
he said. The thing twitched and Harry yelped and then looked embarrassed.
What is it?
He asked Hagrid, who beamed.
Part Flitterby, part Grindylow,
he said proudly.
Where'd you get it?
Sirius asked, frowning. Hagrid looked evasive, and Sirius suspected whatever answer he was going to get was not going to be an entirely truthful one.
I found.
There was a knock on the door, and Hagrid, looking relieved, but confused, heaved himself to his feet and went to open it.
Good afternoon, Hagrid,
an all-too-familiar voice drawled. Sirius frowned and glanced at the door, but couldn't see past Hagrid's bulk.
Say hello, Draco. Hello, Hagrid,
Draco said pleasantly. Sirius' eyebrows rose. Lucius' disdain for Hagrid was not a well-kept secret, and Sirius was pleasantly surprised that it hadn't been passed on to his son.
Professor Snape,
Hagrid said.
And, was it Draco? Draco Malfoy,
Sirius heard Draco say.
Lucius Malfoy's son.
Hagrid said, sounding puzzled. His head moved, and Sirius would have bet anything he was looking at Snape.
One of them, yes. May we come in?
Poor Hagrid was probably so startled and confused that he did as he was asked without questioning it. Snape swept in, dressed in black as usual, and Draco followed him, looking around curiously, and then grinned and made a beeline for Harry, not seeming at all surprised to find him there.
This is for you,
Snape said, passing Sirius a familiar notebook, without as much as a greeting.
Hello to you too,
Sirius said, rolling his eyes, as he accepted his acclimancy notes back.
How did you know you were here?
Snape finished for him, taking the seat Dumbledore had occupied earlier.
It is difficult for anything to stay a secret at Hogwarts, as you well know, and is, frankly, impossible, once certain parties are involved.
His dark eyes went to Hagrid at once. Poor Hagrid was still standing by the open door, looking utterly bewildered.
Can I get you tea?
He asked weakly.
No, thank you,
Snape said, with a barely concealed sneer. Hagrid looked lost, so Sirius asked for a refill. Hagrid gave him a grateful look.
There are some interesting points in there,
he added, nodding at the book on the table in front of Sirius.
Poorly expressed, and completely lacking any sort of technical description, but interesting nonetheless. Worth your time?
Sirius asked, smirking. He wanted to ask whether Snape had tried to employ any of the mental Patronus things Sirius had come up with, but knew he'd never get an honest answer.
Quite,
Snape said, looking as if he had taken a bite of something sour.
Congratulations, Black, for the first time in 30 years, you've managed to accomplish something worthwhile. It seems you have a functioning brain in there after all. Lucky me,
Sirius muttered. He took a sip of tea, and folded his hands, and Hagrid sat down again.
Draco, I wouldn't,
Harry said, and Sirius and Snape spun in unison, to see Draco squinting at the Flitterby Grindylow.
Draco,
Snape said, in a warning voice, and Draco jumped back as if burned.
You promised to behave. I'm behaving,
Draco muttered. Snape stared at him, and Draco glowered back. Sirius thought it was rather like the staring contests he and Harry had, but they weren't trying to communicate, it seemed to be a battle of wills. Both looked away at the same time, and Snape said nothing about Draco misbehaving, and Draco took a step away from the creature. Sirius caught Harry's eye and shrugged.
Well, we should be off,
Padfoot said, about half an hour after Draco and Snape had arrived. Hagrid had been called up to the school to help Professor Diggle with some sort of defense accident, and so Harry, Padfoot, Draco, and Snape had headed outside, to wander the snowy grounds. Beside Harry, Draco looked disappointed.
I've got to see Dumbledore quickly, and then we'll fly home,
Padfoot said, more to Harry than to Snape and Draco this time. Harry gave Draco an apologetic look and Draco shrugged, but there was a definite slump to his shoulders that hadn't been there a moment ago.
Surely you needn't drag the boy around everywhere,
Snape sneered, looking at Padfoot.
I wouldn't call it dragging,
Padfoot shot back.
He's too young and too much like his father to think otherwise,
Snape said. Harry blinked. He wasn't entirely sure what had happened between Snape and Padfoot, and he wouldn't call them friendly, but they were certainly civil. And, this was the first time Snape had mentioned James without making it sound like an insult.
So what, leave him here?
Padfoot asked.
Wander off on my own, and then listen to you harp on about what a rubbish godfather I am, and how irresponsible. I would not. You would. You have.
Padfoot said.
Full moon, remember.
Snape's sallow face turned a tiny bit pink and then went back to normal so quickly that Harry thought he might have imagined it.
I would not be opposed to watching him for you,
Snape said. His eyes were fixed on Draco as he spoke, and he sounded rather like he would rather spend time with the thing on Hagrid's windowsill than Harry, but he had still said it. Harry and Padfoot gaped at him.
You?
Padfoot asked.
I am qualified to watch children, Black,
Snape drawled.
Many of them at once. 2 should be simple, even if one of them is the spawn of James Potter and was raised by you and your furry friend. But, you, hate,
Padfoot stammered. Snape rolled his eyes.
Go and see the headmaster,
he said.
Potter will be here, and unharmed when you return, I assure you. Do you want to stay?
Padfoot asked.
Oh, so now the boy gets a choice. Shut up, Snivellus.
Again, Harry marveled at the lack of venom and the fact that Snape didn't look overly bothered by that name.
And let Harry answer.
Sure, Harry said. He wasn't quite sure what was going on, but he was curious enough to want to stay and find out. Padfoot looked bewildered.
There,
Snape said.
Now, hurry along, Black, you're wasting time.
Padfoot glanced around at them, and then caught Harry's eye and patted his pocket. Harry nodded, he did have his wand. Padfoot nodded in response.
I'll be back soon,
he said. The three of them watched him make his way up to the castle, and then Draco looked at Snape and mouthed a thank you that Harry wasn't sure he was meant to see. Snape nodded and waved them away. Apparently his idea of supervision was long distance, but warned them to stay in sight or there'd be dire consequences.
What was that about?
Harry asked as he and Draco headed toward the lake.
Nothing,
Draco said.
I'm not an idiot,
Harry said. Draco gave him a doubtful look, and Harry rolled his eyes.
Snape hates, well, maybe not hates, but he doesn't like me. He wouldn't offer to spend more time with me. He sent us away,
Draco said, gesturing back toward the dark figure sitting on a rock. Against the snow, and from a distance, Snape looked uncannily like a Dementor.
That's hardly quality time.
Still, Harry said. Draco said nothing. Harry gave up hoping for an answer after about a minute, and decided he'd be silent too. If Draco wanted to talk, he could start the next conversation. And he did, eventually.
My father thinks I'm crazy,
Draco told him.
Or sick.
He added as an afterthought, kicking a bit of snow.
He what? He had me tested,
Draco said quietly. He picked a rock by the lake's frozen shore and sat down, wrapping his grey cloak around him. Harry grabbed a handful of his own cloak, which was a dark red, sat down, and then tucked it around him to keep out the cold. The air around the lake was cooler.
Why? I don't know,
Draco said, and Harry believed him.
You don't think it's anything to do with the Muggle-born thing, do you?
Harry asked. Draco shrugged.
I think it's silly,
Draco said eventually, in a rather haughty tone.
I mean, if anyone needs to be tested for insanity, Potter, it'd be you.
This comment was followed by a grin, which faded quickly, when Harry flung a chunk of snow at him. Draco spluttered and covered his head with his hands, but Harry didn't bother with a follow-up attack.
What in Merlin's name was that for?
Draco demanded, peeking out.
You're supposed to be nice, Potter.
Harry wasn't sure what to say to that. He didn't consider himself a mean person, so he didn't disagree with what Draco had said, but he couldn't think of a way to respond to that without sounding arrogant.
Thanks. It's a good thing,
Draco assured him. And then, before Harry could respond, Draco sighed.
That's probably why Father had me tested, a Malfoy, friends with a Potter.
Friends? Harry asked, a little surprised. He liked Draco more than he had during his stay at the manor, but he still had absolutely no idea what to make of him, and was still completely confused by his polar personalities. He had thought Draco held some sort of friendly tolerance for him, not that Draco actually considered him a friend.
Yes, Potter, friends,
Draco said.
I thought you thought I was an idiot,
Harry said, grinning.
Oh, I do,
Draco said matter-of-factly.
You're incredibly frustrating, and I doubt you've even looked at that dictionary I bought you.
Harry had, once, but only for about 5 minutes, so he didn't bother to correct him.
But that's nice. Simplicity. I'm your friend because I'm simple.
Harry asked, wrinkling his nose.
Exactly, Potter. You're the least complicated person I've ever met, and it's a nice change.
Harry was reasonably sure that he should feel insulted by that, but was equally sure that Draco meant it as a compliment, so he didn't know what to say.
Thanks,
he said, tentatively.
See,
Draco said.
Simple. Never change, Potter.
End of chapter. Chapter 72, The Serpent Sworn.
Oh, here comes trouble,
Rattler said with a grin. He was waiting for the lift on level 2, as Harry and Padfoot stepped out of it.
How've you been, Harry? Good, thanks,
Harry said with tentative smile back.
Morning,
Padfoot said, yawning.
Morning, Black,
Rattler said, still smiling.
What are you here for today? Filing.
This last question was accompanied by an expression that was half sympathetic, half apologetic.
Hopefully it's something more exciting than that,
Padfoot said ruefully. He grinned.
I was hoping to make an arrest or two, and maybe uncover a conspiracy theory or murder plot. But, yeah, I suppose paperwork's all right too.
Rattler laughed.
I've got errands to run this morning,
Rattler said, adjusting his briefcase.
But if you're too busy to keep an eye on young Potter while you're saving the Ministry, feel free to leave him with me this afternoon.
Rattler grinned at Harry.
I think I owe you a game of Exploding Snap.
Harry laughed.
And I'll win this time,
Rattler added.
But what'll you do this morning? Surely you've got better things to do than follow this one.
He gestured to Padfoot.
Around. Arthur Weasley's bringing his two youngest in,
Padfoot said,
and we'll let them entertain themselves. I think Arthur's partner's out today, so they can have his side. Exactly right,
a white-haired wizard wheezed as he passed them and entered the lift.
Morning, Perkins,
Padfoot said cheerily, as Perkins pressed a button. Rattler looked at Perkins too and muttered a word that was on the list that Harry wasn't allowed to use at school.
Just hold the door, would you, Perkins?
Rattler called, before he turned back to Harry and Padfoot.
I've got to go, I'm afraid, but my office is open this afternoon.
He hurried into the lift, which was being held open by an elderly wizard with fluffy white hair. Rattler waved through the closing doors with one hand, and fumbled for something golden in his robes with his other.
He's cheery this morning,
Padfoot remarked, and then gestured to Harry.
This way, kiddo.
Harry followed him through a narrow web of corridors, and looked around curiously while he walked. That turned out not to be the best idea, because every time he glanced into a cubicle, a hard-faced Auror looked back suspiciously. Harry decided to keep his eyes on Padfoot's back instead. Padfoot stopped in an area of the Auror department that Harry vaguely recognized. He knew the bathroom, because he had used it while he was staying in Bones' office, and he recognized the cluster of offices, Bones, obviously, and also Rattler's, and then Scrimgeour's a short distance away from those, closer to the cubicles. It was Scrimgeour's slightly ajar door that Padfoot went to, and knocked on. There was a bang and a muffled curse from inside. Padfoot drew his wand at once, and Harry put his hand in his pocket, ready to grab his if he needed it, and then Scrimgeour called, "Come in."
Is everything all right, sir?
Padfoot asked cautiously, as he pushed the door open. Scrimgeour was sitting at his desk, the top of which was scorched and smoking slightly, and had shoved a piece of parchment into a drawer as soon as they walked in.
Everything's fine, thank you, Black,
Scrimgeour said tersely.
Put that away.
Padfoot tucked his wand back into his robes and Harry took his own hand out of his pocket.
Good morning, Potter. Good morning, sir,
Harry said.
What happened?
Padfoot asked, gesturing to the desk.
Oh, that.
Scrimgeour asked, fidgeting.
Nothing.
Harry could tell from the set of Padfoot's mouth that he didn't believe him, but before he could say anything, Scrimgeour had put his hands together and said,
Now, I've got a few things in mind for you today. Yes?
Padfoot asked, after a moment's hesitation. Scrimgeour began to outline Padfoot's day, and Harry only heard a bit about a lecture and Padfoot's opinion before he zoned out and started to pay more attention to the office. It was smaller than Bones and more interesting by far. Bones had had a large bookshelf, while Scrimgeour had a smaller one, half filled with books, half filled with strange objects that looked a bit foreboding. A portrait of an old man dozed in the corner, above an ornate object that looked a bit like a sundial, and Scrimgeour's desk itself was covered with stacks of parchment and a collection of potted plants, none of which Harry recognized. One twitched, even as he watched it, and he took a step closer, curious. Padfoot and Scrimgeour were too deep in their conversation to notice as Harry got his wand out and prodded it. He knew better than to try that with his hands, and neither spared him more than a glance when the plant reached for his wand and he jerked it out of the way.
Sorry,
he muttered. Scrimgeour waved a hand, and Padfoot ruffled his hair, and Harry dropped his eyes, embarrassed. They fell on a heavy envelope on the desk. It was singed, obviously it had been too close to whatever had scorched the desk, and it had a strange mark on it, where a Muggle stamp would go, 2 crossed keys, inside a circle made out of a coiled snake. Scrimgeour noticed Harry looking at it and cleared his throat. Harry took a step back, and Scrimgeour buried the envelope under a pile of other parchment. Padfoot glanced between them, looking confused, and a little concerned.
So,
Scrimgeour said, giving Harry a sharp look, despite the fact that his words were directed at Padfoot.
You understand what you have to do today?
Yes, sir, Padfoot said, in an odd tone.
Excellent. Go and do it.
Padfoot and Harry exchanged a look and headed for the door, but Scrimgeour's voice stopped them.
A word, please, Potter.
Both of them stopped.
Not you, Black. Kindly wait outside. But Potter has managed to survive without you being present in the past.
Scrimgeour's eyes flashed. Harry had, until now, thought he could trust Scrimgeour. Now, though, he wasn't so sure.
I am certain he can do so again.
Padfoot clenched his jaw.
Is there a problem? Yes, actually,
Padfoot said.
As his guardian, I have every right to know. There are some things that he and I need to speak about,
Scrimgeour said.
Privately. You will have to trust me when I say it is nothing inappropriate. You're off, Strange, this morning,
Padfoot said bluntly.
I don't know what's going on. No, and it is none of your business,
Scrimgeour said sharply. See? Padfoot said.
And you want me to trust you? Yes, Black, trust me, like I trusted you when I vouched for you in May,
Scrimgeour snapped. Padfoot deflated at once. He gave Harry a look, one that Harry interpreted to mean that Padfoot would fuss if Harry was worried, but would otherwise subside. Harry bit his lip and nodded, and Padfoot, looking wary, left the room.
I'll be right outside,
Padfoot said, probably as much to reassure Harry as to warn Scrimgeour. Scrimgeour shut the door behind Padfoot with a flick of his wand, and muttered a spell that would probably stop noise from leaving.
You saw the symbol, didn't you?
Scrimgeour said. Harry considered lying, but suspected Scrimgeour, a practiced orator, would probably be able to tell.
A snake,
he said quietly.
With 2 crossed keys. I thought so,
Scrimgeour sighed. He stared very hard at his hands, which were clasped on the desk, and then looked up at Harry.
Someone, or a group of someones, tried to kill me this morning.
Harry wasn't sure what to say to that, so he said nothing.
I'm looking into it, or I will be, once we finish here, but I'm going to ask you to stay quiet about this. But, if someone's trying to kill you, then shouldn't. Potter, I am head Auror and have been for many years. Please don't presume to tell me how to do my job.
Harry flushed and looked down at his trainers.
I am keeping this quiet,
Scrimgeour said again.
I don't want people to worry over what might be nothing. And if it's not nothing, sir?
Harry dared to ask.
Then I will alert the appropriate people at the appropriate time.
Harry was silent for a long time, expecting Scrimgeour to dismiss him, but he didn't. Finally, Harry asked,
So why are you telling me? You saw the symbol of the serpent sworn,
Scrimgeour said.
I needed to be sure you wouldn't run to tell your godfather, and that you yourself wouldn't overreact. He wouldn't tell anyone,
Harry said, not sure why Padfoot knowing would be an entirely bad thing.
Maybe he could help. I think Black might find this particular group's associations and beliefs a little too personal. I don't know the extent of his involvement in the war, but I know he was involved, and now that you're in the wizarding world and he feels obliged to protect you. No, the Serpent Sworn aren't something Black would be content to let be, if he knew they were functioning again.
The war? And Padfoot wanting to protect me from something I might overreact to? I slid down Harry's spine, as his thoughts reached a chillingly certain conclusion.
Do you mean to say, that these Serpent Sworn, that they're somehow connected to Voldemort?
Harry asked. Scrimgeour's face twitched at the name, but otherwise, his face was impassive.
I said nothing of the kind,
Scrimgeour said stiffly, but Harry knew he was right.
But if it's Voldemort,
Scrimgeour twitched again.
Then shouldn't we do something?
Harry asked, with dawning horror.
I am handling the situation. I ask that you trust me to decide when or if something must be done.
Scrimgeour said.
It was war last time,
Harry said.
He killed my parents. If something's happening, sir, then shouldn't we do? We will not do anything. The Serpent Sworn are not such a big threat that I cannot handle them alone. You are the boy who lived, but you are also a boy and you have no place in this.
Scrimgeour dwindled off, looking unnerved, as if he couldn't decide what to call the situation, and that worried Harry. He had always thought Scrimgeour was reasonably competent, but now he wasn't so sure.
You will stay out of this, and more importantly, stay quiet about what you saw here today, and what we have spoken about. Am I clear?
Harry said nothing.
Mr. Potter, I cannot allow you to leave if I do not have your word. All right,
Harry muttered, not meeting Scrimgeour's yellow eyes.
Pardon? I said all right.
Harry snapped, crossing his fingers behind his back.
You have my word. Your word that what?
Scrimgeour pressed.
My word,
Harry said in a steely voice, thankful for all the practice with loopholes that living with Creature had given him,
that I won't do anything that would be considered overreacting.
Harry was fairly sure that letting Padfoot and Moony know immediately would not be considered overreacting, especially since it could well be Voldemort they were dealing with here.
And that I'll keep everything I've heard today quiet.
He hadn't promised to keep it to himself, though. Harry fought to keep his smugness from showing. Appearing satisfied, Scrimgeour nodded and scratched absently at the scorch mark on his desk. Then he looked up at Harry and smiled, seeming, rather abruptly, like the Scrimgeour that Harry had known in the cells and in the courtroom, rather than the one he had spent the last few minutes with.
"Thank you very much, Potter."
He looked absurdly pleased with himself.
"Can I go?"
Scrimgeour waved a hand, giving him permission. He had just pulled his communication device out of his pocket and muttered something into it, and Harry left the office quickly and shut the door behind him.
"What in Merlin's name was that?"
Padfoot demanded. Harry glanced around. The corridors were much busier now than they had been when he and Padfoot entered the office.
"I need to talk to you,"
Harry said in a low voice. They heard movement in Scrimgeour's office, and moved around a corner. A moment later, he exited, but didn't once look in their direction.
"Somewhere else,"
Harry muttered, watching Scrimgeour head toward the lifts. Padfoot nodded at once and led Harry away from Scrimgeour's office. They were stopped several times by Aurors or trainees. Harry recognized Wellington and Yaxley, and also Roberts, who wanted to say good morning to Padfoot or both of them, and several minutes later, they finally managed to find themselves a reasonably secluded bit of corridor. It was outside some sort of maintenance cupboard, where, oddly enough, a few people were massing, but thankfully they didn't pay either Harry or Padfoot too much attention. Those that didn't approach.
"All right,"
Padfoot said, eyeing the others.
"Let's hear it." "There was an invel." "Sirius." "Harry."
Tonks came barreling out of nowhere, looking flustered, and Harry swallowed what he had been about to say. While he liked Tonks, and trusted her, he thought Padfoot should hear it first, and then Padfoot should decide who should or shouldn't hear it.
"Watch her,"
she said when she reached them.
"Dora,"
Padfoot said. He nodded at Bones, who had arrived at the same time as Tonks, and kept walking. She headed for one of the people outside the cupboard. Padfoot then returned his attention to Dora.
"Could you give us a min?"
Harry saw his nostrils flare.
"Is everything all right?" "I think so,"
Tonks said, but she didn't look certain.
"What?"
Padfoot asked.
"Well, Scrimgeour's talking to Remus,"
Tonks said, an odd look on her face.
"Remus?"
Padfoot asked blankly.
"As in Mooney?" "With Scrimgeour." "What other Remus do you know?"
Tonks said, rolling her eyes.
"Why's he even at the ministry?"
Padfoot asked sharply.
"We had breakfast in the dining hall in the atrium,"
Tonks said,
"and then Scrimgeour got out of the lift as we were saying goodbye and asked Remus for a word." "About?" "I have no clue,"
Tonks said, looking peevish.
"Scrimgeour told me I'd better get to training or I'd be late, and he had that no-nonsense sort of."
She threw her hands up.
"I didn't really have a choice,"
she said, looking a little defensive. Padfoot looked troubled.
"All right, you lot, down we go,"
Roberts called, appearing out of a cubicle on Harry's left. McKinnon was by his side, and she gave Harry and Padfoot a nervous sort of nod, and Tonks a friendlier smile. Around them, people started to move, Tonks among them. She gave Padfoot a grim look and a wave, and went to join McKinnon and Wellington. Yaxley and Pruitt were a few steps behind them, deep in conversation.
"Black,"
Roberts said, approaching with a wave.
"Scrimgeour tells me you're observing today." "Yeah,"
Padfoot said, glancing at Harry.
"He wants my opinion or something."
Padfoot looked confused for a moment, and then worried.
"Could I just have a moment with Harry?" "He's not coming down with us, is he?"
Roberts asked.
"We're covering Unforgivables, you know, not really appropriate." "No, Arthur Weasley's agreed to watch him,"
Padfoot said.
"Oh, good,"
Roberts turned his head and shouted,
"Weasley!"
A few seconds later, Mr. Weasley poked his head out of an office down the hall, and waved uncertainly. Roberts gestured for him to come over.
I hear you're watching Potter.
Mr. Weasley gave Roberts an odd look, and smiled in a confused sort of way at Padfoot, who gave him the exact same smile back.
Can I just...
Padfoot began.
Roberts, Black.
Scrimgeour was back, and Harry automatically moved closer to Padfoot, his jaw setting. Scrimgeour eyed them, and then looked at Mr. Weasley, who was looking awkward.
Training started. Is there a problem? No, sir,
Roberts said at once.
Come on, Black.
Padfoot gave Harry a meaningful look, and Harry inclined his head slightly. Padfoot had to go, else Scrimgeour would be suspicious. If he wasn't already.
Be good for Arthur, kiddo,
Padfoot said.
I'll see you for lunch. Bye,
Harry said, as Padfoot followed Roberts away. Scrimgeour arched an eyebrow at Harry and then followed the others into the cupboard.
Never a dull moment,
Mr. Weasley said, putting a hand on Harry's shoulder.
Guess not,
Harry mumbled, troubled. Something was up, and Scrimgeour and the Serpent-Sworn were at the heart of it. And, if everyone seemed determined to keep an eye on Padfoot, as Scrimgeour and Roberts had seemed keen to do, then Harry would look into it himself, and tell Padfoot what he could when they were safely alone at home.
Shall we go and see Ron?
Arthur asked brightly, gesturing down the hallway.
He's waiting in my office.
Sure, Harry said, cheering at the mention of Ron.
And Ginny.
A sad look passed over Arthur's face, and he adjusted his glasses.
She didn't come in today, I'm afraid,
Arthur said, pushing open the door. Ron, who had been swiveling around in a chair, looked over and grinned.
Hey, Harry,
he said, and Harry grinned back. Then, Ron turned to his father and asked, Who?
Ginny,
Mr. Weasley said, and the same sad expression flickered over Ron's face. Mr. Weasley sat down at his desk and started opening letters, and Harry went and perched on the edge of the desk Ron was near.
She wanted to,
Ron told Harry.
But she thought staying home was more important.
He paused, looking stricken.
Not that you're not important, I mean, just that.
Ron stopped and ran a hand through his hair, looking agitated.
Bloody hell!
There was a soft reprimand from Mr. Weasley at that point.
I made that sound bad. It's, our neighbor, Ginny's friend's mum, died last week.
Ron stared at the desk in front of him, and Harry said nothing, for fear of offending him.
Ginny's looking after her. But she wanted to see you.
Ron added.
Tell her thanks,
Harry said, and Ron nodded.
But I reckon she made the right choice, staying home. She's obviously needed more there than here.
Ron scratched absently at his arm and then scowled.
What's wrong?
Harry asked.
Fred and George, my brothers, sent a cursed letter home,
Ron grumbled.
We've all been itchy ever since, well, except for Ginny, because they told her how to fix it. Have you tried Finite?
Harry asked.
Mum has,
Ron said.
I'm trying to get her to send them a howler.
Harry's eyebrows shot up.
But she hasn't yet, so we're still itchy. Padfoot might know something that'll help,
Harry offered.
He's good at that sort of thing. I can ask him at lunch, if you would like.
Thanks, Ron said.
It's probably that, or wait until I'm frustrated enough that I can use accidental magic to get rid of it.
Harry smiled.
And that'll do us, I think,
Roberts said, as Blackburn and Hemsley lowered their wands. Dora, who had morphed herself into something resembling a flower, and one of the male trainees, who had just confessed several embarrassing truths about himself that Sirius would have preferred not to know, both slumped.
Well?
Scrimgeour, who had hovered at Sirius' side the entire time, asked.
Hasn't really changed,
Sirius said, shrugging.
But it's not worse. No,
Sirius replied, frowning. Scrimgeour nodded and excused himself. He wanted me down here, for 3 hours, just for that? Sirius wondered, and groaned. He had hardly even been paying attention, instead, he had been fretting about what Harry might have wanted to tell him.
You didn't even do anything,
Marlene said, in a voice that was almost playful. Her eyes were guarded, though, and her smile was strained.
Never mind. You did well,
Sirius remarked.
Thank you,
she said warily. Dora bounded over to join them, looking more humanoid now that she had been released from the Imperious curse.
That was weird, wasn't it?
She said, looking unnerved.
I mean, I knew I wasn't a flower, but at the same time I didn't, you know. It's a bit like that,
Sirius told her, grimacing.
But that's the first step, being able to differentiate between their instructions, and your own thoughts. Fighting's the tricky part,
Marlene added.
You didn't look like you had any trouble at all,
Dora said, giving her a curious look. Marlene shrugged and said,
I think I'm just stubborn. Maybe just a bit,
Sirius said, chuckling. Marlene didn't look offended by the comment, but she didn't laugh, or even smile either. Dora glanced between them, uncomfortable.
I think I'll go and find Gawain,
Marlene said after a moment.
All right,
Dora said easily.
See you tomorrow, then. Nice seeing you,
Sirius added, and got a strange sort of smile accompanied by a shrug in return. Dora looked like she wanted to say something, but apparently decided against it.
Shall we get lunch?
She asked instead. Sirius nodded, and the pair of them joined the rest of the crowd that were heading back upstairs to the Auro department.
Just hold on,
Sirius said, as they stepped out of the cupboard together.
I'll grab Harry, and...
Dora squeaked as she collided with the back of a female trainee, and Sirius managed to steady her before she fell completely.
Serpent sworn are not something you can keep quiet about, Rufus,
Amelia said. Sirius could just see the back of her head and robes from around the corner. She wasn't talking loudly, but every trainee in the vicinity had stopped and was silent, so her voice carried down the hallway.
And especially not if they're trying to kill you. You're too valuable to this department to let them even attempt. I'm handling it,
Scrimgeour said, sounding irritated.
No, you're not. And you're not taking this seriously, which is exactly where the biggest danger lies. Better than we overreact. Apparently,
Scrimgeour muttered.
And fix this before it actually becomes a problem, for more people than just yourself, then leave it and let this problem grow. You might be the head of the Auro department, but I, with Thomas's help, am head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and I see this as a threat even if you don't. You've dealt with their type before, and that's why you're reacting this way, it's personal for you, which is exactly why I didn't want. If we leave this, it could well become personal for all of us,
Amelia snapped.
You've got 2 days to start countering this, or I'll step in and do it for you.
Sirius heard her shoes, some sort of heel, from the sound of it, clipping on the floor as she left. Scrimgeour didn't say anything else, and didn't walk back around the corner. Obviously he had gone the same way as Amelia, which was lucky. As soon as the conversation stopped, the 30 or so people who had been eavesdropping broke into hushed conversation.
"Who are the serpent sworn?"
one man asked.
"What in Merlin's name could have happened for it to be personal for Bones?"
another man wondered. Sirius and Dora shared a look.
"I think I ought to find Mad-Eye,"
she said hesitantly.
"Good idea. I'm going to find Harry."
Sirius thought he might know now what Harry needed to tell him.
"Will we see you for dinner?" "Nah, Mum wants me home tonight,"
Dora said, shrugging.
"It'll just be the three of you."
She looked as troubled as Sirius felt as she walked off, and tripped on her own feet as she went to find her mentor. Harry was, thankfully, where he was supposed to be. Sirius hadn't really thought he'd leave and go walking about, but with Harry, it was often difficult to be certain. Arthur's desk was unoccupied, but neither of the boys seemed fussed. They were sitting at Perkins' desk, writing on pieces of scrap parchment.
"So then I said to Charlie, 'Hello, Mr. Black,'"
Ron said, spotting him before Harry. Sirius gave him a bemused look. Mr. Black was a strange name. Harry said a hello too, but his eyes were on his drawing.
"Hello. Where's Dad's just gone to the bathroom."
Sirius approached their desk, as Ron finished whatever he had been saying to Harry before he arrived, and both boys laughed. Games of hangman and knots and crosses lay littered around the desk. Ron, Sirius was amused to see, had abandoned a drawing of some sort of circle with arms and legs. Sirius had seen Ginny's drawing of the dragon, and while she was quite good, it seemed Ron had not inherited her drawing skills. Harry was drawing an odd symbol, and while it was no work of art, it was also not something he had made up himself. There were several crossed-out versions of the same thing lying around him. It was a snake. Sirius wasn't sure what sort, because Harry wasn't that good at drawing, that made a ring, inside which were 2 keys.
"What's that?"
Sirius asked him in a low voice, but after what he had just heard between Amelia and Scrimgar, he thought he knew. "The Serpent Sworn," Harry wrote, glancing at Ron, to make sure he wasn't paying attention. Ron was adding facial features to his drawing. Then, Harry blew on the ink to dry it, folded the parchment up carefully and placed it in his pocket.
"Are you hungry?"
Sirius asked him, heart pounding.
"Starving,"
Harry said, and then cast a reluctant look in Ron's direction.
"Dora's not coming anymore, something's happened."
Harry's hand twitched toward the pocket he had put his drawing in, and Sirius inclined his head.
"Would you and your dad like to join us?"
Sirius asked Ron, and Harry's expression brightened again.
"Join you?"
Arthur asked, stepping back into the office.
"For lunch,"
Harry said, with a smile. Arthur looked troubled for a moment, and reached into his pocket. Sirius wasn't sure why, until he realized Arthur was counting the coins he had there.
"It's my shout,"
Sirius said, as Arthur hesitated, looking between Ron, who looked uncomfortable, and Harry, who looked hopeful.
"To say thank you for keeping an eye on Harry." "It's not, we can't let you do that." "Of course you can,"
Sirius said, with a smile. Ron was now wearing a hopeful expression that matched Harry's, and Arthur appeared torn. Scrimgar hadn't really given him anything to do that afternoon, so Sirius intended to go home as soon as he could. He and Harry had a lot to discuss. But they needed to eat first, and he really did want to thank Arthur and Ron for keeping Harry company. He wondered where Ginny was today, and thought lunch was a good way to do that. What he was reluctant to do, however, was spend much more time in the ministry, at least until he knew what was going on. And, since he had Harry, he was reluctant to stay anywhere potentially dangerous.
Come on,
Sirius said.
I know a nice Muggle cafe just around the corner.
Arthur's eyes shone at the mention of Muggles, and Sirius knew he had him convinced. End of chapter. Chapter 73, The Quest for Answers. School resumed for Harry 2 days after Sirius overheard Scrimgeour and Amelia discussing the Serpent Sworn, and Sirius was glad, not because he wanted him gone, but Harry had, not entirely surprisingly, got as caught up in it as Sirius himself had. He needed something to take his mind off it, because, as determined as he was to help, there was nothing he could do at this stage. Sirius was also rather wary. Harry had told him everything Scrimgeour had said about the Serpent Sworn, and from that Sirius had gathered that these Serpent Sworn people were somehow connected to Voldemort. Scrimgeour had pretty much told Harry that, but he hadn't yet been able to figure out how. Serpent Sworn wasn't a name he had ever heard, and through Reg and the Order, he had thought he was very well informed. He had asked Remus, who had been very reluctant to talk about his encounter with Scrimgeour, but Sirius had pressed until he gave in and admitted that Scrimgeour had only wanted to make sure that, now that Remus was dating a trainee, he was over his days of punching Aurors. Sirius had laughed at Remus' embarrassed look while he told the story, but something hadn't sat right with him about the explanation. It was possible that Scrimgeour would still be sore about Remus punching him the previous May, but... Well, Sirius didn't think his best friend was a liar. Certainly, Remus wouldn't lie about something as important as Voldemort, but he didn't think he had been entirely truthful either. Not knowing who or what the Serpent Sworn were made him seriously uncomfortable, particularly because, while they might be targeting the Ministry, anyone connected to Voldemort would almost certainly have it out for Harry. And Harry was, now that school was back, out of Sirius' sight for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week. Sirius still thought it was a bad idea to let him take his wand to school, but Sirius had put a charm on Harry's mirror to shrink it, and protect it from being broken, and Harry now carried that in his pocket at all times. Sirius, likewise, was carrying his, and was comforted by the thought that if something happened, he could be at Harry's side in seconds. Despite the potential danger hanging over them, though, Harry's first day had been an exciting occasion. Sirius had been working on his bike in his spare moments since getting it back. Dumbledore had stored it in a room on Hogwarts' 7th floor that Sirius hadn't even known existed, and it had greatly resembled a motor garage, into a functional state, and he had taken it to drop Harry at school, much to the excitement of his classmates, and the disapproval of the teacher on morning duty. Harry, for his part, was taking the news of the Serpent Sworn rather well. He had been spooked after the day at the Ministry, and had been asking a lot of questions about the war, but Sirius had, eventually, after his second day at school, foisted him off onto Remus, and that seemed to have calmed Harry down more than Sirius had managed to. Remus, too, had taken it in stride, and looked grim whenever it was mentioned, but not terribly worried. And, while it was good Harry was no longer flinching at every noise or sudden movement, and that Remus wasn't panicking and making contingency plans, Sirius was still very on edge when he was in at the Ministry, and days of research, in Grimmald's library, and in the Ministry's vastly more extensive one, had yielded nothing. Which was why Sirius was standing, very reluctantly, outside this particular door. He checked his watch. It was just after 4, which meant classes should have ended by now, and then knocked. This is a terrible idea, he thought. The door opened and Sirius was greeted by a supremely unimpressed look.
Twice in as many weeks.
Sirius shoved his hands into his pockets and said nothing.
Aren't I lucky?
Very, Sirius replied flatly. Snape gave him a cold look, and Sirius refused to break eye contact, certain that if Snape decided to try to read anything out of his head, that Padfoot would be able to put a stop to that. Snape lifted his eyes eventually. He glanced at the dark stone ceiling of the Hogwarts dungeons, as if he was praying for strength or patience, and Sirius rolled his own eyes.
To what do I owe they? Pleasure?
Snape asked finally.
Can I come inside? You are currently placing an inordinate amount of stress on a very fragile tolerance,
Snape informed him, but stepped aside.
Touch nothing.
Sirius didn't. He stayed standing, like a naughty schoolboy, while Snape swept over to his desk and sat down. Snape didn't offer him a seat.
Well. Who are the serpent sworn? I beg your pardon. The serpent sworn,
Sirius said. Snape hesitated and then said,
I don't know. Rubbish,
Sirius said, and Snape's eyes flashed.
You hesitated. I hesitated because I was trying to form a polite answer instead of an insulting one. I see now I needn't have bothered. You have to know,
Sirius said.
Very well,
Snape said.
You've caught me, Black. I, Severus Snape, am the leader of these swearing snakes. Serpent sworn,
Sirius corrected, frowning.
The name doesn't matter,
Snape snapped.
Because, as I have told you, I haven't even the slightest idea what you are talking about. None?
Sirius asked.
It doesn't sound even a tiny bit familiar. Not in the slightest,
Snape told him.
Should it? I don't know,
Sirius sighed.
All I've got to go on, is that it's something to do with Voldemort. The Dark Lord?
Snape asked, and Sirius curled his lip.
No, the other Voldemort,
Sirius muttered.
Pardon? Nothing,
Sirius said. He had come for help, and he wasn't going to get it if he was insulting.
I assumed that the serpent sworn were, I dunno, elite Death Eaters, or something, but I can't find anything on who they are, or what they want. The elite?
Snape asked slowly. He was silent, surveying Sirius through cold, dark eyes for almost a minute, before, looking unsettled, he spoke.
It seems you're more of a fool than even I ever thought.
Sirius said nothing, and Snape lay his arm on the table and pulled back his sleeve. The dark mark rested there, seemingly innocent, a faded black stain on the pale skin, except Sirius knew what it meant.
Did you forget about this? No,
Sirius said.
It's the reason I came. You came to ask an old Death Eater for help regarding what you suspect may be the uprising of new Death Eaters.
Snape asked.
I don't think I've ever heard anything more stupid, and I mark Gryffindor essays.
He recovered his arm.
We are not friends, Black, despite having proven on several occasions now that we can share the same space for short periods of time without the world ending. I hold no fondness for you, nor do I particularly care whether or not you make it to your next birthday, nor do I owe you anything, be that my information, or my honesty. Okay,
Sirius said, because really, there wasn't much else he could say. Snape was right, they weren't friends, and the rest of what he had said made perfect sense too. Sirius did, oddly enough, trust him more than was probably smart to, but he certainly didn't trust him blindly. His trust came from trusting Dumbledore's judgment, but Sirius didn't trust Dumbledore blindly either. And, he wasn't about to tell Snape that, because that gave him information he'd rather his old enemy not have.
Okay.
Snape repeated, blinking.
Yep,
Sirius said, stepping back toward the door. He had got most of what he needed anyway. Snape hadn't seemed at all concerned by the serpent sworn until Voldemort was mentioned, and Snape's dark mark was faded. Obviously, he wasn't involved, at least not directly, but hadn't wanted to say anything more on the matter until he had instructions, and knew what speculation it was and wasn't safe to share. And Sirius, despite his contempt for all things Death Eater, could appreciate that, even if it annoyed him. So, fairly certain that Snape currently didn't know any more about the Serpent's Sworn than he himself did, Sirius didn't want to risk undoing all of the awkward, tense progress they had made for something that wouldn't get him results.
Thanks for your time.
He let himself out and shut the door behind him. He let out a deep, steadying breath. Quite a bit of tension faded, once there was a door between him and Snape, and was half certain that Snape was doing exactly the same thing on the other side of the door. Sirius walked after that, through the familiar corridors of his old school, thinking. He had a general destination, Dumbledore's office, but he certainly wasn't taking the quickest route there, so that he could give himself proper time to consider all of his options. By the time he had reached the gargoyle, and was greeted by the cheery statue, he had decided on his course of action, and was feeling nervous, but certain that he had made the right choice.
"Come in,"
Dumbledore said, as Sirius knocked on the wood of the door. Shaking his head in wry amusement, Sirius pushed open the door and walked in. Dumbledore looked surprised for a moment, and then offered Sirius a tentative smile. Then his eyes dropped to Sirius' side, and the smile faded and became concerned.
"Is everything all right?" "Nothing's wrong yet,"
Sirius said, carefully. Dumbledore gestured to the seat in front of his desk and Sirius sat down.
"Something's come to my attention though, through the Auro department. I half expect Amelia or Mad-Eye have already had a word with you."
Understanding flickered over Dumbledore's old face, and Sirius sat straighter.
"You know. I assume you're talking about the Serpent Sworn?"
he asked heavily.
"Yes,"
Sirius said.
"Are they with Voldemort? What do they want? How many are there?" "May I just say, before I answer your questions, that I am touched you still brought this problem to me, despite the fact that you no longer trust me as you once did." "I trust you with this,"
Sirius said quietly.
"You've got more experience with this sort of thing than anyone else I know, and I'd be stupid to ignore that."
Dumbledore watched him without blinking, but Sirius didn't feel anything probing his head, so he thought it was safe to assume that Dumbledore was only looking at him. What he was looking for, Sirius had no idea.
"I'm certain you've heard it numerous times in the last few months, but allow me to add my own support to the fact that you have certainly grown up."
"Thanks," Sirius said, a little uncomfortable with Dumbledore's piercing stare, and more than a little determined not to show how much the praise from his old headmaster meant to him.
"So, the Serpent Sworn." "Ah,"
Dumbledore said, folding his hands on his desk. The atmosphere in the room changed at once, from friendly and a bit wary, to businesslike. Fawkes ruffled his feathers and glanced between them both. Dumbledore spared his pet a look, and then turned back to Sirius.
"We don't have it confirmed," he said, "but we believe it's possible that they are in league with Lord Voldemort, or are at least following his ideals to some extent." "Old Death Eaters." "It's possible, but again, unconfirmed,"
Dumbledore said gravely.
"What we can be certain of is the fact that there is someone clever behind it. They have so far managed to operate with the utmost secrecy, and toe the line between threatening and mediocre. Alastair tells me that Scrimgeour was unprepared to take them seriously until Amelia talked sense into him."
"Shouted, really?" Sirius said, and a small smile worked its way onto Dumbledore's face.
"I had not heard that," he murmured, seeming amused. "What they want, I imagine, is power. Most groups like this do, as I'm sure you know, but they have not yet started to target Muggle-borns or those considered blood traitors. Their only attack so far, that anyone knows of, was on Scrimgeour himself, and Scrimgeour is a half-blood, who was in Slytherin." "So? What? They want chaos for the sake of chaos?" "Perhaps," Dumbledore said, no one will know until they make another move, and I fear we'll be too late to do anything but react, and try to recover, because we have no way of predicting what they'll do next." "Oh, well, that's comforting,"
Sirius said, rolling his eyes. Dumbledore smiled sadly and said,
"Your optimism for an easy resolution is admirable, Sirius, but you've been at this long enough to surely know that these things are never as simple as we'd like them to be." "I know,"
Sirius mumbled.
"So what else can you tell me?" "Very little. I have been given a limited amount of information on the matter, most of which I've shared with you. I've made deductions, but whether they're true or not remains to be seen." "What deductions?"
Sirius asked.
"That they're a reasonably large group." "And you consider large to be?" 30 or more, I would imagine." 30?
Sirius asked weakly.
"But a group that big would have done something to draw attention." "Unless they were structured,"
Dumbledore said.
"Which I suspect they are, and they're, as I said before, almost certainly led by someone that knows what he or she is doing." "Which could support the Death Eater theory,"
Sirius said.
"It could,"
Dumbledore agreed.
"It also could not. It's difficult to know. But, I think it is safe to assume that they've had training of some form, or that they are a collection of very talented witches and wizards." "Why?"
Sirius asked.
"Attacking the head of the Auro department is a bold move," Dumbledore said. "Tom didn't attempt it with the Death Eaters until the 6th or 7th year of his campaign."
Sirius set his jaw. Charles Potter's death hadn't been nearly as difficult for him to overcome as Lily and James' deaths, but the mention of the man he had considered a father set off a dull ache in the pit of his stomach.
When he had the resources, and when his Death Eaters had the experience and skill necessary to pull off such a feat. "So they're dangerous?"
Sirius asked flatly.
"And that they possibly have people on the inside, likely in the DMLE or magical maintenance, who are keeping an eye on things."
Sirius had to admit that Dumbledore had a point. Remus had wondered the same thing a few nights ago. Dumbledore cleared his throat gently.
"I suggest, if or when the time comes that you are forced into a confrontation, that you do not underestimate them."
Dumbledore leaned back into his chair, looking grave.
"All right,"
Sirius said, a bit unnerved. Sometimes, he looked back on the war with fondness. James and Lily had been alive, he had had Marlene, Peter hadn't destroyed everyone's lives yet. But he had forgotten how much he hated the stress of feeling like it was up to him to help, and that he had to always be doing something, else he was a coward, or wasting time, or putting people in danger. He hadn't missed that feeling at all.
"And that's all you know?" "I do not have the influence in the Auro department that I do with some of the others."
Sirius could appreciate that, while he knew Amelia and Mad Eye would keep Dumbledore in the loop, the Auro department functioned in a way that was almost completely removed from the rest of the ministry. They had for years, and it had been a cause of consternation with ministers over the years, particularly those that wanted to feel like they were in control of their ministry. Auros and Hit Wizards certainly didn't spend as much time checking up on policies with the minister and undersecretaries as the other departments did.
"I know only what I am told." "And no one's telling you anything?"
Sirius asked.
"Alastair has been assigned the case,"
Dumbledore told him.
"I know that much." "That's good, he can keep you updated."
Dumbledore sighed, looking resigned, and said,
"Not quite, I'm afraid. Scrimgeour is keeping a very close eye on the case, and as such, a very close eye on Alastair." "So he's staying quiet,"
Sirius surmised.
"And rightly so,"
Dumbledore replied.
"Alastair's loyalty should be to his job more than it should be to me." Would you like a sweet?
Thanks, Sirius said, accepting one. Dumbledore plucked one out of the bowl for himself, and popped it into his mouth.
This is not yet my battle. I do not feel as responsible for this as I did for Tom's uprising, and the Ministry has not yet asked for, formally, or through their own lack of action, my assistance. I am happy to let them handle things for the time being. So if I need information, go to Mad-Eye?
Sirius asked.
Perhaps,
Dumbledore said, twiddling his thumbs. Sirius sighed.
Is something wrong? Mad-Eye and I, well, we get along, but it's not like it was before everything. He doesn't trust me like he used to. Crises will do strange things to trust,
Dumbledore said.
Look at us. Yeah, normal people trust people they know they can trust more easily. But Mad-Eye, great bloke, but he's the most paranoid, secretive person to grace Britain, and I'm fairly certain he'll trust me less. Constant vigilance,
Dumbledore murmured, and Sirius chuckled.
Exactly. He won't say a word, other than to tell me to keep my nose out before he hexes a chunk out of it to match his.
Dumbledore was the one chuckling now.
Then perhaps,
he said, once he had settled a bit,
you could talk to someone that Alastor trusts. The serpent sworn.
Narcissa repeated, squinting at him through the bars of the manor gate. Severus tightened his cloak around his shoulders as he was buffeted by a particularly strong gust of icy wind, and felt momentarily sorry for Narcissa, who was wrapped only in a dressing gown. She shivered.
No, Severus, the name means nothing to me. Lucius hasn't mentioned it?
He asked.
No,
she said, apologetically, but firmly, and then yawned. Severus didn't think he had ever seen her do anything as mundane as yawning.
I don't even think I've heard.
She yawned again.
What's happening? Nothing,
Severus replied.
Severus, it's the middle of the night,
she said flatly.
Why would you come now, if it wasn't? Perhaps I thought I ought to repay you for all the times you've inconvenienced me,
he said coolly. Narcissa's mouth twitched, and he wondered when they had reached the point that one of them could throw barbs without the other feeling the need to retaliate. He trusted her a bit more than Lucius. Narcissa, at least, had simple motivations, when it came down to it, but that still wasn't all that much, particularly after she had told Draco that she shouldn't be trusted.
It's snowing,
she said, shifting one slippered foot. He eyed the wet, pale blue satin with disdain, and she shifted again and folded her arms.
Obviously this is important, Severus, or you wouldn't be here, and obviously it's something that requires discretion, or you would be having this conversation with my husband. Discretion would be appreciated,
Severus said, and she nodded curtly. He was troubled on the inside. Black had come to him of all people, to ask for, well, not help, but certainly information, and he wouldn't have done so without strong need. Severus didn't loathe the man anymore, but the dislike was still there, and he was reasonably sure Black felt the same, so Severus suspected the visit that afternoon had been one born of desperation. And if the Dark Lord was involved in any way, shape, or form, then Severus needed to know.
At least for the time being. What's happened?
She asked again. Severus hesitated. While he trusted Narcissa enough to come to her for information, he didn't think telling her was a good idea. Not because he feared she'd tell, but because he feared what she'd do, as far as Draco was concerned, if she thought the Dark Lord was coming back. He'd give her warning if or when that occasion arose, but giving her time to stew on it wouldn't be good for anyone.
If it becomes relevant, I'll let you know,
he said.
I assure you of that. You don't trust me,
she said, in a hurt voice that he suspected would work on most people. He, however, knew that Narcissa was too controlled to let her voice sound that way by accident, and that she probably didn't care enough about his opinion of her to be hurt by his lack of trust. He arched an eyebrow. She tucked her hair behind her ear. It was a futile endeavor, because the wind was tugging on it in all directions.
After everything the pair of us have been through the past few years, you don't trust me enough to let me. I will treat you with the same courtesy as you have treated me,
he said.
I will tell you what I believe you need to know, when it is relevant.
Her hurt facade dropped at once, and for the second time that night, her mouth twitched.
Very well,
she said. Severus looked over her shoulder at a brown blob that was moving about in the gardens behind her. He drew his wand, and Narcissa spun, her hand jumping to her own wand, which had been somewhere in her dressing gown.
Dobby,
she said, relaxing. Her tone was both explanation and a summons, and the elf vanished out of the gardens and appeared beside her on the frozen gravel.
Could you make me a cup of tea, please? A warm one. Of course, mistress,
the elf squeaked.
But master is telling Dobby to finish the gardening. 'Tis Dobby's gardening night, mistress. Nothing's going to grow in this weather,
she said dismissively.
I'll handle Lucius. You may handle my tea.
The elf trembled and vanished with an obedient squeak.
Did you need to ask anything else?
she asked, turning back to Severus.
No. And Draco's still welcome tomorrow. Draco's always welcome,
Severus said quietly. And it was the truth. Draco was visiting more regularly now. Severus wasn't sure what excuses Narcissa was making to Lucius, but frankly, he didn't care. It wasn't his problem, and Draco and Lucius and Draco and Hydrus were now so different that Severus got the impression that Draco wasn't having an easy time at home, not because they were bullying him, but more because he was lonely. Severus always tried to make Draco feel as welcome as possible. Severus wasn't a very welcoming man, and he still gave Draco a lot of tedious, menial tasks to work on, but he also took care to listen to his godson, and he took genuine interest in how Draco was. Draco had quickly realized that Severus' office, and time with Severus, was safe, and had responded in turn. Severus wasn't sure whether he was saddened, or selfishly pleased that his 10-year-old godson's best friend was a middle-aged potions professor.
Always?
Narcissa asked. Severus inclined his head, and Narcissa smiled.
Thank you, Severus. It's nice to know you're watching out for him. And the training, I haven't thanked you for it, and it hasn't been easy, on any of us, but I truly think that it's for the best. That remains to be seen,
he said, but he thought, or hoped, she might be right. He also hoped that there was a chance that Draco might not follow in his father's footsteps and join the Death Eaters if or when the time came, but he thought the chances of that were slim. Draco would probably look at the dark mark on his father's arm, and at the one on Severus, not knowing that Severus didn't much care for the brand, and decide he wanted the same. Severus sighed. The boy wasn't even at Hogwarts yet, but Severus and Narcissa had already planned his entire future, and he'd follow that future, because they had manipulated him into doing so. Narcissa pursed her lips and said,
I'm going to have a cup of tea, and then I'm going back to bed. Good night, Severus.
Good night, he said, and pulled his wand out of his pocket.
And, Severus,
she called, before he could disapparate.
If I hear anything about your serpents, I'll let you know.
He inclined his head, and spun on the spot, as Narcissa strode back toward the manor, like a ghostly shadow against the snow.
You're late. Close the door.
The man who had just entered the room did so without question.
It's dark, he said. Is that a problem?
Replied the man who had just reprimanded him. There was something like humor in his voice.
I'd have thought you of all. No,
replied the other.
Good.
The man's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he was able to make out the other man, sitting on an overturned crate of broom polish, and with all the haughty grandeur of a king on his throne.
Would you like a seat? I'll stand.
The man who was sitting down, shrugged, and then looked up, eyes sharp and bright in the darkness.
You wanted to tell me something. Black's been asking questions. Has he?
There was interest in the seated man's voice now, and the barest hint of smugness.
Fancy that. You're not surprised,
the man snorted.
No,
the seated man admitted.
But it's good to know all the same. Where did you hear that? I have sources too,
the man replied, and the seated man's face twisted.
I hope they're reliable. If this gets to the wrong people. My source is trustworthy, the man said, folding his arms, and privately enjoyed how rattled his superior was to hear about his sources. Ha! You're not the only one who can play this game, he thought. Has Black found anything? Nothing that endangers us,
he said, and then with grudging admiration,
if anyone was going to work it out, it'd be him. Perhaps,
said the seated man, but it was obvious that he agreed.
With any luck, he, and the rest of them, will have no idea what's happening until it's happened. With any luck,
he agreed.
You really think we can pull this off? I think so, yes,
the seated man said confidently.
It's a bit more extreme than anything we've ever attempted.
The standing man murmured his agreement.
But everyone knows their role, and we're a proficient lot. The only thing I'm a little worried about.
The man's eyes widened at that. The seated man was not the type to admit to worrying about anything.
Is people getting hurt? If our lot get hurt, it'll be their own fault,
the man said gruffly.
They should be able to handle anything thrown their way.
The seated man made a noise that might have been agreement, but the man couldn't be certain.
Should being the key word here,
the seated man said.
But time will tell, I suppose. Are you still thinking Christmas? I am.
The man nodded thoughtfully.
Thank you for telling me about Black. I've got others watching, but the more eyes we have on him, the better.
The man snorted, and the seated man smiled wryly.
It's all for him, after all.
End of chapter. Chapter 74, Part of the Family. Sirius fiddled with his scarf, a bright, Gryffindor-red one, that he had bought one day with Harry during the school holidays, and then gave up on that and shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans. He had to pull them out again a moment later to open the classroom door, however, and that made him feel even more restless than he had before. He had arrived early, 7 o'clock was the scheduled start time, but not early enough that he was the first one there. Mrs. Phelps was there, still wearing the floral blouse, cardigan, and long skirt he had seen her in when he dropped Harry off that morning, and Mr. Benson was in his usual suit and tie, talking to her. Several parents, who obviously knew each other, had already seated themselves at tables and were deep in conversation. Sirius, who was a new parent with the school, and wasn't involved in any of the parent associations, knew no one except the teacher and Mr. Benson, and was feeling a little more out of his depth than he had expected. He wasn't sure how to go about this. Was he supposed to introduce himself, or was he supposed to just sit down and wait for Mrs. Phelps to start telling him about Harry's progress? He found himself thinking he should have dragged Remus along. He had offered, but Remus had been a bit funny about it, saying it wasn't his place as much as it was Sirius, godmother or not. Sirius had told him he was more than welcome, but Remus had opted to stay at home with Harry, and try to help him with his animagus project. Harry had thought of something for his incantation on Halloween, and Remus was helping him to word it, like he had helped Sirius, James, and Peter a lifetime ago. Good old articulate Moony, Sirius thought, and then glanced around again, and grumbled to himself under his breath. I should have brought him tonight, he's Harry's godmother, for Merlin's sake. He has every right to be here. He looked at the other parents who were, predictably there as couples, some were holding hands, or seated very close together, others just smelled the same, as if they had shared a car to get there, or were exchanging those couple-wide looks. Sirius felt a little lonely, because of that, and also because he was probably a good 5 or 10 years younger than most of them. I should definitely have brought Moony, if only so I had someone to talk to. Or, in an ideal world, I wouldn't be here. It'd be Lils and Prongs. For the 1000th time, he couldn't help but think the pair of them would have loved something like this. Or maybe it was just that they had never had the chance to experience things like this that made Sirius think they would. Excuse us, someone said behind him, and Sirius realized he was blocking the door. He muttered an apology as a tall woman wearing a string of pearls, and a short, balding man squeezed past him. Sirius followed their examples and collected a badge from the desk closest to the door. The badge said Patrick Evans, and had a line of 4 animal prints on it. There were 3 paw prints, 2 large, 1 quite a bit smaller, and a hoof print. Sirius knew then that the kids must have designed the badges in art, or just in their free time. He smiled as he put it on, and genuinely thought his badge had a better design than those with just flowers, or stars. He's a good kid, he thought, still smiling, and followed Harry's scent to the other side of the classroom, where there was a cluster of desks and 2 small chairs that he gingerly eased himself into. In the middle were 4 pieces of paper, questionnaires, for the parent-teacher night, by the looks of it, and pencils. Harry's desk had a label saying Harry Evans, and had been colored in with red and yellow stripes. There was also a passable sketch of a lion, and Sirius spent a moment wondering, since it had been a while since he considered it, which house his godson would end up in. He hadn't really reached a conclusion before Mr. Benson sat down opposite him. His name tag had a picture of a book on it, as did the label that announced it was Blaze's desk.
Patrick,
Mr. Benson said.
How are you? Hi, yeah, good thanks,
Sirius said, offering him a smile back.
Good, good. Yourself? Oh, fine,
Mr. Benson replied.
Busy, what with the holidays just ending, but no complaints. Harry settled back in again. Yeah, no problems. And Blaze? Loves it,
Mr. Benson said, looking amused. Sirius nodded, not really sure what to say. He thought he'd have better luck holding a conversation with Blaze than with Blaze's father. Blaze, at least, he knew a bit about.
So, who's your team?
Sirius had to swallow the automatic response of cannons, and ended up making an odd choking noise.
Sorry.
He asked.
Your team? In football.
Mr. Benson said.
Oh,
Sirius said. He knew football was some sort of muggle sport, probably involving feet and a ball of some sort. Or at least he assumed as much, going by the usual standard of creativity muggles used when they named things. He didn't know anything more about it than that, though.
London.
It was a question, but Mr. Benson didn't seem to notice.
Arsenal.
He smiled.
They're doing well this year. Might even win.
Sirius blinked, confused, but knew better than to say anything.
I'm a Liverpool supporter, myself.
He patted a little red badge on his jacket, above his name tag.
And I'm sort of hoping we'll win, but time will tell. Yeah, Liverpool's also. Good,
Sirius said. Mr. Benson beamed.
And Harry? Does he follow Arsenal as well? Sort of,
Sirius said.
I suppose, yeah. Maybe we should get the boys together for the finals, watch the game, and have a bit of a play ourselves.
Mr. Benson said, with an expression that was part cautious, part eager. Sirius recognized it. It was one that he had worn when he and Arthur discussed bringing the kids into the ministry to see each other. Sirius found himself nodding.
Bit of friendly competition,
Sure, Sirius said, not entirely sure what he was agreeing to. Thankfully, before Mr. Benson could say any more about football and Sirius had to pretend he was a muggle, another couple arrived. The husband pulled the seat out for his wife and then went to collect his own chair from the front.
Ah, Pauline,
Mr. Benson said, giving the woman a polite smile, though not as enthusiastic as the one he had given Sirius.
Mr. Benson,
the woman replied. She had a very long, sharp nose, thin lips that were painted red, but kind brown eyes and short, flyaway brown hair.
How are you? Good, thank you,
Mr. Benson replied.
David.
The man carrying a chair had a name tag that declared him David Granger. He was a short man, taller than his wife, and a bit stockier, but probably a head shorter than Sirius, and had a very white smile, curly brown hair and green eyes. Sirius eyed their name tags again. Both Grangers had had drive added, and that the tags had been colored, green and purple, respectively, instead of drawn on.
Hello, Emmanuel,
Mr. Granger said, and then spotted Sirius and said a hello to him as well.
You must be Harry's father,
Mrs. Granger said. Sirius nodded.
And Mr. and Mrs. Granger? You're Hermione's family. Drive and Dr. Granger,
Mrs. Drive, Granger said, almost sternly.
But you've got the rest right. Pleasure to meet you,
Sirius said, a little uncertain now.
You too,
Dr. Granger, the male one, said.
Your son's been a good friend to our Hermione this year. She's always had a bit of trouble making friends,
he added, in an undertone. His wife sighed.
She's been a good friend to Harry too,
Sirius said.
And Blaise, of course,
Dr. Granger, the female, added.
She spends quite a bit of time talking about the both of them. I'm glad to hear it,
Mr. Benson said, with a smile that was more genuine this time.
She's very bright, isn't she?
Drive and Dr. Granger exchanged a look that was half proud, half helpless.
Very,
the female Dr. Granger said after a moment.
Sometimes too bright, I think. Where are you sending her next year?
Mr. Benson asked. The Grangers exchanged another look.
We've had a few offers,
the male Dr. Granger said, holding his wife's eyes.
All to very good schools. Very prestigious schools. You must be proud,
Sirius said, feeling like he ought to contribute to the conversation a bit. Yet another look passed between the couple beside him.
Yes, we're proud,
the female Dr. Granger said at last. She smelled uncertain.
We've left the choice up to Hermione, of course, but it's not really a choice, she's had her mind made up since her birthday.
The male Dr. Granger nodded.
And we'll support her in that. Right,
Sirius said.
What about Harry and Blaze? Harry's off to boarding school, the same one I went to as a boy,
Sirius said, letting a bit more pride seep into his voice, since he thought that was probably what was expected at this sort of parent-teacher thing.
He's excited, I think, but I'll miss him. It's just the two of you, then?
Dr. Granger asked sympathetically.
Nah, we've got our housekeeper, and my brother's over a lot too.
Sirius swore that if the Grangers exchanged one more look, he was going to do something drastic about it. It wasn't like he and the Marauders had been, where they talked with looks. This was more like forming judgments with looks. It was disconcerting.
So, Blaze? Oh, he'll just go to the local school, I think,
Mr. Benson said.
It is just him and me, so it's easiest to have him somewhere nearby.
And, the female Dr. Granger began, but at that point, Mrs. Phelps clapped her hands, drawing everyone's attention. Sirius was startled to see how many parents had arrived while he and Mr. Benson were talking to the Grangers.
Thank you, everyone,
Mrs. Phelps said, beaming around at them all.
It's wonderful to see so many of you here, eager to hear about your children's progress.
No one said a thing, but the teacher wasn't deterred.
Now, I can see some of you are busy looking at some of the posters and artwork we have on display, but I'll ask you to sit down for the moment, so I can talk to you as a group, and then I'll speak to each of you individually. If you haven't noticed already, you'll see there's a form for you to fill out while I speak. That's for you to put any questions or worries on, and we can address them when I come around.
Everyone shuffled around, knocking their heads on low-hanging posters while Sirius watched with amusement. A particularly tall man was having great difficulty folding himself into one of the small chairs. Sirius watched him give up, and stand behind his wife instead. Mrs. Phelps looked as if she'd like to tell him off for standing, but thought better of it. She launched into a detailed talk, and referred to notes regularly, to outline what the class had been working on since September. She talked about where they were up to in certain subjects, what the class average was in certain areas, and what they had left to cover before the school year ended in June. Sirius zoned out about a minute in, because Harry had told him most of this anyway, and frankly, it was boring. He revised his opinion of the night after that. Lily would have loved it, James would have fronted up eagerly, and been a bored, whining mess 5 minutes in. He stole a pencil from the tin, and one of the question forms, schemed over that, decided against answering what is your greatest concern about your child's learning? And other such questions, and ended up turning the sheet over so that he could draw on the back of it. He drew a lion first, inspired by the drawing on Harry's desk label, and then moved on to assorted paw prints, and then the serpent's sworn sigil, because, despite the fact that it had all been quiet on that front, and he was trying to keep it out of his head tonight, it was still there.
You ought to be paying attention,
Dr. Granger whispered, and he glanced over, taking in her pursed lips and frown, and decided to ignore her. The male Dr. Granger looked torn between disapproval, like his wife, and amused exasperation. Across from him, Mr. Benson was also drawing on his form. He was coloring in the circles of letters. Sirius thought that if the headmaster could get away with it, then he certainly could. Sirius drew a dog next, a dog that was lifting its leg on the serpent's sworn sigil. He chuckled to himself as he sketched that, and then draped his arm over the sketch as Mrs. Phelps announced she'd be coming around, table by table, to speak with them individually. She started at the table next to theirs, so Sirius had time to doodle a few other pictures, a broomstick, a rather poor imitation of Hedwig, and a rather good one of Creature, before Mrs. Phelps appeared next to him and cleared her throat. Both Grangers were watching him with disapproval. Sirius hastily shoved the paper under the desk, and wedged it under the metal bar that was there.
"Hello,"
he said, smiling at Mrs. Phelps.
"Mr. Evans," she sighed. "Would you like to talk about your son, or would you like me to come back to you when you've finished drawing?"
"Now's fine," he giving her a charming smile. She nodded and pulled up a seat.
"Now,"
she said, flipping through her marking book.
"Young Harry. You know, of course, about the swearing incident?"
she said sternly.
"Yes,"
Sirius said, fighting like hell to keep a straight face. He was reasonably sure his lip twitched, however, because Mrs. Phelps sighed again.
We talked about it at home." "Good. There haven't been any repeats, have there?" "No,"
she said, her expression clearing again.
"No, though he does tend to get distracted. Sometimes he's talking with other students."
Her eyes drifted over Mr. Benson, and also over the Grangers, who looked shocked at the idea that their Hermione might talk in class.
"Other times? Well, I don't know. He seems off in his own little world. Does he get enough sleep? What's his usual bedtime?" "He gets enough sleep,"
Sirius said, and then wondered if he did. Harry regulated his own bedtime, but he was usually asleep by midnight. Not keen to question that in front of his teacher, however, he said,
"And his marks are good, or so he tells me." "Yes, they're quite good. I wouldn't call him the top student."
Again, her eyes drifted to Hermione's parents.
"But he does well in tests, and more importantly, he's consistent. He does his homework to a high standard, and I really do think he's trying his very best, which is what counts." "Good,"
Sirius said.
"He's missed 2 days of school. I will ask in the future that you phone the front office when he's going to be absent, because it makes things easier on this end. But otherwise, Harry's a nice boy, very friendly, very polite, occasionally cheeky, though only to his classmates, and it's a pleasure to teach him. I was very pleased with his poster last term." "Good,"
Sirius said again.
"Did you have any queries? Anything you were concerned about?"
No," Sirius said.
"Is there anything I should be concerned about?"
Mrs. Phelps looked startled to have the question turned back at her.
"No,"
she said.
"I don't think so. He should settle into high school easily, and as I've said, I'm happy with how he's doing this year."
For the third time, Sirius couldn't think of anything to say except,
"Good."
Sirius' birthday came shortly after, on the 10th, and was met with rather more fanfare than he had expected, by Harry and Creature, who started things off by appearing beside his bed in the morning, and shoving a steaming cup of tea, and a tray of bacon and eggs into his lap. It was a Sunday, so Harry had the day off, but Sirius still had to go into the ministry for a few hours and help out. While he was there, however, he was pounced on. Arthur Weasley met him in the lift, and cheerfully wished him a happy birthday, and passed him a thin package, which Sirius was shocked but touched to receive, and Roberts passed him in the corridor and pulled a parcel, neatly wrapped in brown paper out of his pocket, passed it to Sirius and then continued on with a distracted smile. Arthur had given him a collection of Muggle motorcycle magazines. Some were very technical, and Sirius couldn't wait to browse through those. Others were the type that he had used the pictures from to label his bedroom wall as a boy, though he doubted Arthur had realized that when he bought them. Roberts had given him a book on aura-level defense against the dark arts, and also a small, glass ball that had some sort of clear liquid inside it. There was a note with it, probably explaining what it was, but Sirius was intercepted by Scrimgeour, who did not wish him a happy birthday, and taken to file papers. He used a shrinking spell on the rest of his presents, and put them, along with the ball, into his pocket, where they stayed safely until he got home at lunchtime and was able to have a better look at them. The ball turned out to be a sensor sphere, which Sirius had read about, but never actually seen. They were designed to detect any lies told by the person holding it. They were not, however, accurate enough to say what part the person was lying about, nor did they encourage the liar to tell the truth, like Veritaserum did. Sensor spheres, though, couldn't be fooled by a clemency, though they wouldn't detect a lie if the person telling it believed it. It was a very nice gift, and Sirius intended to go to see Roberts the next day and thank him for it. Sirius' other gifts were nice too. Remus had brought him the usual combination of sweets and prank items, as well as a book on different types of combat, open, close-quartered, indoors, outdoors, and how to take the advantage of any fighting environment. He had also chipped in with Tonks, to buy Sirius a black leather jacket. He had lost his old one at the end of the war, and was very pleased by the replacement, pleased enough, that he wore it for the rest of the day. Creature had sewn him a new set of robes, in a very, very dark red, and Sirius was touched by that. Usually, Creature's gifts were limited to birthday cakes. Sirius got one of those as well. But his favorite present was from Harry. It was a long chain, with a single, simple dog tag on it that said Padfoot.
Moony helped me with the spells. I helped you find the spells,
Remus corrected, from the couch, where he was sitting with his arm around Dora. Harry shrugged and turned back to Padfoot.
It doesn't transform,
Harry said, pointing to it.
It doesn't transform?
Sirius asked, not quite following.
When you turn into Padfoot,
Harry amended.
You know how everything you're wearing is? I dunno, swallowed, when you transform. This won't. Or shouldn't.
Sirius grinned and put it on, and then bent into Padfoot. When he looked down, the chain was indeed there, like a loose collar. His tail started to wag, and Harry scratched Padfoot's ears absently and said,
People might, you know, think you're a stray when you're walking home or to school without me.
Harry grinned.
This way, they know you've got a family.
Harry, of course, had meant the present as a bit sentimental, and a bit funny, but to Sirius, it was much more. Remus knew that. He could tell that from the way he was watching them. They know you've got a family. Sirius whined happily. His tail was going mad, and in danger or taking someone's eye out, and went to lick every part of Harry's hair, neck, cheeks, and ears that he could reach. The four of them, 5, with Creature, spent the night very casually. Creature prepared a roast dinner for them all, which they ate down in the kitchen, and then they took cake upstairs into the library, where they ate it while they played several rounds of Exploding Snap. The first game was Harry and Sirius against Remus and Dora, and then they shuffled the teams for the following games. Whichever team Harry was on won, except for when he was paired with Dora. They drew, because Harry's quick reflexes were counterbalanced by Dora's clumsiness. After that, Remus and Dora went downstairs to make tea. Creature had gone to bed, and Harry pulled his animagus incantation, or what he had come up with so far, out to show Sirius. He and Remus had been working on it while Sirius worked that morning. I am the wolf born of stag and doe, was what he had written, and circled. Obviously he and Remus had played with the wording of that a fair bit. And below that, he had written, dark fur. And my pack.
I like that,
Sirius said, tapping the line about the stag and doe. Harry smiled at him, but the expression was quickly replaced by a small, impatient frown.
9 words in 9 months,
he said, rolling his eyes.
Did it take you this long? Longer,
Sirius said.
Ages, actually.
The incantation was, in his opinion, the hardest part. It was difficult to volunteer words about yourself, without being biased one way or the other, and was also very difficult to find the right words to summarize an entire person in a few short sentences.
This was the part where Peter caught up a bit. He was good at finding the key parts of his character, and James kept trying to add too much detail, and I didn't add enough. "I think I take after you,"
Harry said, with a small grin, and went back to scowling at his parchment. Sirius reached up to touch the dog tag and chain that already felt like they belonged on his neck, and then ruffled Harry's hair.
"How about something to do with our pack?"
Sirius suggested.
"Like?" "Dunno, you tell me." "We're happy,"
Harry said.
"Maybe something about wagging tails."
He nodded to himself before Sirius could say anything, and started to write something down. Sirius said nothing. He didn't want to disturb the creative process, so he stood quietly, and left the room. Harry glanced up, briefly, but his attention was quickly drawn back to his work before he could utter a protest. Sirius went to join Remus and Dora in the kitchen, where they were talking quietly over their mugs of tea. Both looked happy, almost ridiculously so, but he could help but notice that Dora looked tired too. Sirius smiled to himself as he glanced at their hands, which were clasped together, very casually, on the tabletop.
"Mind if I join you?"
Sirius asked.
"No,"
Remus said, just as Dora said,
"Go ahead."
Sirius didn't bother with tea or coffee. Instead, he cut himself a piece of leftover cake. It was his third piece that day, but it was his birthday, so he didn't think it mattered, and settled himself on the bench opposite them.
"Have you had a good day?"
Dora asked.
"Brilliant,"
Sirius said honestly.
"Nice to take your mind off things?"
Remus asked, looking a bit sad.
"Thanks for that,"
Sirius grumbled, as those things, namely the serpent sworn, but also Remus' odd behavior, reasserted themselves.
"Sorry,"
Remus said, grimacing, but he didn't really look it. Sirius shook his head, glanced at Dora, and then back at Remus, and said,
"I think Harry could probably use your help upstairs."
Remus didn't even look suspicious. With a small, abstract smile, he gently extracted his hand from Dora's, kissed her on the cheek and then stood and left the kitchen. Sirius gave Dora a few minutes to recover. She looked a little embarrassed by Remus' display of affection, but also rather pleased, and then spooned off a corner of his cake and fixed his stare on her.
"What?"
Dora asked, when she noticed him watching.
"How's work?"
Sirius asked.
"You look tired." "It's busy,"
she sighed.
"You know that, though." "How's the serpent sworn case going?"
Sirius asked. Dora's expression closed immediately. She actually got rid of her eyebrows, and made her skin scaly and eyes lizard-like, because it made her face hard to read. If she had gone for a rat, canine or herbivorous mammal, Sirius would have had a chance, but lizards weren't his forte.
"How did you know?"
she asked, his voice rather sharp.
"Dumbledore. He said Mad Eye had the case."
"Dumbledore," she muttered, and then shook her head. Her features went back to normal, or as normal as Dora could be, and her hair was a pale, thoughtful sort of blue.
"Well,"
Sirius said, when she didn't offer anything.
"Well, what?"
she asked, in a tone that told him she knew exactly what he was talking about.
"Dora." "I know,"
she said, grimacing.
"I know we're family, and that you're a good Auror, even if you technically aren't one at the moment, and I know you want to help, but I can't say anything. Mad Eye made me promise." "Does Remus know?"
Sirius asked, arching an eyebrow.
No,
she said, looking guilty about that too.
He knows I'm a bit stressed, and he knows what case I have, but he doesn't know any of the details either. This is top secret, Sirius. So you don't think I can keep a secret?
Sirius asked in a light-hearted voice.
No,
she said at once.
Look, if it was up to me, I'd tell you, because I think we need the extra help, but I've been specifically asked not to tell. Me. Anyone,
she said, and then hesitated.
I shouldn't even tell you this, but someone planted that envelope in Scrimgeour's office. It wasn't an owl that delivered it, it was left on his desk. Someone's on the inside, an Auror, a trainee, someone from magical maintenance, or just someone from the DMLE. No one's even supposed to know Mad Eye and I have the case, because that could ruin everything. I can help. I'm sure, she said, looking like she meant it. But I could lose my job for even having this conversation with you, Sirius. And Mad Eye's lenient about some things, but if he wanted you told, he'd have told me. I'm sorry.
Her hair turned an unhappy blue, and when Remus and Harry trooped downstairs later on, Remus glanced between them, looking troubled. Apparently, he wasn't sure who had upset who, and then he and Harry exchanged a grim look. Sirius caught Harry's eye as soon as Remus was occupied with Dora, but Harry just shrugged, filled himself a glass of juice and apparated out of the kitchen again. I suppose I'm on my own, then, he thought. And he was on his own. November drew to a close, and the weather grew colder as December began. Harry continued to go to school. Dora looked tireder every time Sirius saw her, and Remus, as far as Sirius could tell, had no idea why and was content to leave it at that. Sirius didn't try to ask Dora for any more information after that, but he continued to check in with his own sources, Snape and Dumbledore and even Kira at the bookshop, but none of them knew anything. Sirius thought that was frustrating Snape as much as it was frustrating him. And he kept an eye on everything as he ran errands at the Ministry, trying to find the person who might be involved. He looked for a tattoo, for a badge, for anything that might identify the spy, but found nothing. Then, at the end of the first week in December, Dora showed up on the doorstep, looking furtive, and holding a large stack of papers.
Remus is at lunch with Matt,
Dora supplied, stepping past Sirius and into the hall. The floorboard creaked, but Sirius hardly noticed that anymore.
I know. Then why? Kitchen,
was all she said. Sirius followed her, almost tripping over Creature on the way. He and Harry were playing a strange version of Bludger, but using apparition instead of brooms. Dora seated herself at the table, and slid the papers over to Sirius.
What are these? The Serpent's Sworn Files, she said. You're joking,
he said, his mouth falling open.
I'm not,
she said grimly. He reached for them and then hesitated.
Why now? Has something? Amelia Bones has been attacked,
she said. End of chapter.